Chapter 1306. After Luo Fan had completely returned to his normal state, the emptiness, desolation, and loneliness emanating from the will of the universe did not disappear, but it no longer emanated from his body. There was no other reason for this. At this moment, his will had completely gathered into a ball, and it had become a bright and round entity that isolated all other external emotions. This was the case even if these emotions were emanated from the will of the universe. And obviously, for these emotions to emanate from his body, it had to go through his consciousness, and he had to feel those emotions himself. Only then could he emanate those emotions. Since his consciousness had already become a ball and was completely isolated from the contamination of external emotions, no matter how powerful these external emotions were, they naturally could not emanate from his body. At this moment, the fluctuations of the four halos had already enveloped the entire world, and the connection between the fluctuations and the four laws of time, space, matter, and energy in the depths of the four worlds had also expanded to the entire world. In other words, at this moment, Luo Fan had actually completely controlled the entire world on the surface. At least on the surface, the four basic existences of time, space, matter, and energy in this entire world were completely under his control. If he wanted to cause a certain location to collapse, reverse time, annihilate matter, and turn energy into nothingness, it was all a matter of a single thought. He did not need to expend any energy at all, and he did not even need to use any means. And anything that happened in any location in this entire world, he only needed to think about it, and he would know it clearly as if he was seeing it with his own eyes. However, although this was already the case, it was clearly far from enough for the four halos to resonate with the four basic existences of this entire world, so that the changes of the four halos could directly reflect the entire world. Luo Fan carefully sensed the entire world, comprehending the pattern of changes between the four basic existences of the laws of this world, and sensing the strange connection between the four types of laws and the other endless laws. As his understanding of the laws of this world deepened, he had already discovered that these four basic existences, in fact, they could be considered as the core of the entire laws of this world. Or rather, foundation. The relationship between these four types of laws and the law layer was similar to the relationship between time, space, matter, and energy, the four fundamental existences, and the entire world. The whole world, in fact, everything, every phenomenon, even every abstract concept, they could all be subdivided into four basic existences, and could be seen as the result of the interaction between these four basic existences. Similarly, there were four types of laws: the laws of time, the laws of space, the laws of matter, and the laws of energy. It could also go through countless transformations, countless combinations, and countless changes to form the entire layer of laws and laws. In other words, the endless and unimaginably complex laws and laws in the entire law layer could be transformed into these four types of laws through various special, simple, complex, or bizarre transformations. In other words, these four types of laws could actually be considered as the four basic laws of the law level. It was as if those four existences were the basic existences of the world. Currently, what Luo Fan could connect to were only these four basic laws. Even if he could change these four basic laws with the help of the halo, it would only be equivalent to changing the foundation of this world. For a complete world, such a change would only result in one outcome, and that was the entire world would instantly collapse due to the change in its foundation. This was similar to a completely built building. If one wanted to make this building that had already reached its limit become bigger and taller, the only way was to demolish the building and build a deeper and more stable foundation. Only then could one build a bigger and taller building on this foundation. If one did not demolish the building, but directly increased and deepened the foundation of the building while it was still in good condition, there could only be one outcome, and that was that the building would directly collapse due to the lack of connection between the top and bottom. There was no other possibility. Therefore, if Luo Fan wanted to expand this world by 10 times, he naturally could not directly change these 4 basic laws. Instead, he needed to expand out from these 4 fundamental laws. He needed to completely grasp the boundless laws of nature constructed by these 4 fundamental laws. He needed to completely grasp the entire layer of laws of nature so that all the changes he made to the 4 halos could be directly reflected on all the laws of nature on the entire layer of laws of nature. Only in this way could he completely reflect the changes he made to the 4 halos on the entire world, and thus expand this world. For example, if you wanted to increase the height of a building, if you had superhuman means, you could simultaneously enlarge the building from top to bottom at the same time. Then, you would naturally be able to avoid the troublesome process of demolishing the building and rebuilding it from the ground up. Expanding these 4 basic laws and using them to control the entire law level was actually set up by Luo Fan more than 8 billion years ago. It was one of the processes that established a connection between the 4 halos and this world. Only by completing this step could he carry out the expansion of this world according to the method he had originally thought of. How many times has the flow of time been accelerated? It's actually been so many years, but less than 10 years have passed in the outside world. Luo Fan thought of the time he had spent in this world and could not help but sigh. He could not help but feel that the Buddhist Supreme was unfathomable. With his own means, setting up a space-time formation that could speed up time by tens of billions, hundreds of billions, or even trillions of times would require layers of nesting. Moreover, it would consume an endless amount of magic power at every moment, so it would not be able to last for long. However, he did not expect that the Buddhist Supreme's magic treasure could actually speed up the flow of time in an entire world by at least tens of billions of times. Only he, who had really done it, knew how difficult it was. He could not help but sigh at the Buddhist Supreme. With a slight jolt in his heart, Luo Fan suddenly felt the change in his cultivation realm, and he could not help but smile faintly. It turned out that after more than 8 billion years, his cultivation realm had unknowingly reached the pinnacle of level 2 pseudo-sage. Now, as long as he entered the state where he could see the 9 steps, he could see that the originally unreachable 3rd step was already in front of him. It seemed that as long as he put in a little more effort, with a slight step forward, he would naturally be able to step onto the 3rd step and become a level 3 pseudo-saint. Such a situation was very obvious. It could only happen when he had already cultivated to the pinnacle of level 2 pseudo-sage. This was also very normal. After all, he had experienced more than 8 billion years, such a long time. Even though he did not cultivate at all in the process, but he was always connected with the will of heaven and earth. He was constantly enduring the impact of the will of heaven and earth on his will, which was equivalent to the will of heaven and earth of this world tempering his will. Such a process was very beneficial to his will. If it was a short period of time, it would be hard to say. However, it had reached the terrifying number of more than 8 billion years, and it had reached such an unbelievable level. It directly improved his cultivation realm by a huge step, reaching the pinnacle of level 2 pseudo-sage. After his cultivation realm increased to the pinnacle of level 2 pseudo-sage, Luo Fan felt that his strength was more than 10 times stronger than before. Even the range of his perception of the state of chaos had increased by a lot, and he seemed to have gone deeper. Many mysteries that he was not qualified to comprehend before seemed to be slightly comprehended at this time. Such a change made Luo Fan quite happy. Regardless of whether he could pass the 3rd round of the test this time, this harvest alone was enough to make him satisfied. It was a pity that this method could only be used when using these 4 halos, and it could only be used in the 3rd round of the test. If it was in an ordinary vast thousand world, it would naturally be extremely easy for Luo Fan to find the location of the will of heaven and earth. As long as he stayed in that world for a long time, he would naturally be able to become omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient in that world. At that time, it would only be a matter of a thought for him to go to the location of the will of heaven and earth. However, in a world of a level like the demon realm, it was simply difficult for him to obtain that kind of omniscient, omniscient, and omnipotent ability. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to find the location of the will of heaven and earth, it was simply impossible for him to have a thought like in the vast thousand world. It would be extremely difficult and arduous to find it. Obviously, for the will of heaven and earth, Luo Fan did not have any good methods to find it at all. Therefore, he could only use the halos formed by these four worlds to have a chance of coming into contact with the will of heaven and earth. The reason why this method could only be used in the third round of the test was even simpler. This time, he had come into contact with the will of heaven and earth for more than 8 billion years to achieve such progress. If he was in the outside world, where the flow of time was normal, how could he waste more than 8 billion years? One must know that after more than 3 billion years, another great calamity would arrive. If he completely wasted more than 3 billion years on coming into contact with the will of heaven and earth and enduring the tempering of his will, it was really not something that could be described as a reckless waste of God's resources. Only in this test, where the flow of time had been accelerated by more than 10 billion times, could he waste time on this. Letting out a long breath, Luo Fan revealed a faint look of regret on his face. Then, he slowly closed his eyes. The halo above his head rapidly shrank, and in the blink of an eye, it shrunk from its original diameter of 1,000,000 feet to 3 feet like before, hovering behind his head. However, even though the halo had shrunk to this extent, the strange fluctuations that were emitted from the halo still existed, still enveloping the entire world within it. The special connection that the halo established with the world still existed. After completing this step, Luo Fan raised his hand and pointed. The fluctuations that enveloped the entire world began to undergo a subtle change. Along with this change, the entire world also began to undergo a subtle change. At this moment, the entire world's breathing method gradually changed. It gradually moved in another direction, a breathing frequency that belonged to Luo Fan. Amidst this change, Luo Fan's body suddenly emitted an indescribable majesty, a supreme majesty that seemed to control the entire world. Amidst this majesty, the strange beasts that had begun to gradually become chaotic and began to gradually calm down. They began to involuntarily shift their gazes from each other to Luo Fan, who was standing on the peak of the highest mountain. That kind of supreme majesty. It was as if this person was the ruler of the world, the master of heaven and earth. 4 creatures from other worlds, even creatures that were countless times weaker than the strange beasts, such a change would still have a chance to resist. But for these strange beasts that were born and bred in this world, that was the supreme law that directly connected to the origin of their lives. They had no ability to resist at all. They could only gradually yield under the increasingly powerful majesty, kneel back to their original positions, and continue to worship Luo Fan on the peak of the mountain compared to the emptiness, loneliness, and worship that was emitted by the will of the world. Although this kind of worship was not as deep as before, it contained more respect, and appeared more domineering. Luo Fan did not care about this at this moment. At this moment, his entire mind had entered the layer of laws of this entire world through the 4 halos of light. Compared to using his own eyes to directly look at the layer of laws of this world, he now had a completely different feeling when using this method. He used his own eyes to look at the layer of laws of this world, but the perspective he used was a partial perspective. Not only could he see the layer of laws of a certain range with his body as the center, but he could also see the layer of laws of a certain range. And now, when he used this method to observe the layer of laws of this world, he was observing it from a macroscopic perspective from above. What he saw was the entire layer of laws of this world, that incomparably huge and extremely complex layer of laws of this world. He could even see the vast and boundless appearance of the great Tao that had completely fused with this layer of laws of this world. Observing the entire layer of laws of this world from this perspective was a completely different experience for Luo Fan. An inexplicable smile naturally appeared on his face. In his eyes, among the endless laws of this world, there were 4 laws that were more or less related to all the other laws, appearing very different. Naturally, it made him feel an indescribable sense of familiarity. These 4 laws that covered the entire world were obviously the 4 basic laws of time, space, matter, and energy. With a slight thought, the halos of light behind his head changed slightly, and the fluctuations that covered the entire world became more intense and faster. Following this, the 4 basic laws that covered the entire world also underwent an inexplicable change. There seemed to be some kind of strange, indescribable existence gradually flowing out of these 4 basic laws, continuously infiltrating more and more of the endless laws and laws. And every law that was infiltrated by that strange existence naturally made Luo Fan feel a sense of familiarity, naturally giving Luo Fan the feeling that he could completely control this law or law. Clearly, this infiltration of this invisible existence was the spread of the influence that the halos of light behind Luo Fan's head had on the entire layer of laws of this world. Although there were many strange existences that spread out from these 4 basic laws of this world, the number of laws of this world was very, very fast. But the number of laws of this world in the layer of laws of this world was just too much. It was a terrifying number that practically surpassed the limits of numerical description. Even if it spread out at this speed, by the time Luo Fan completely infiltrated the entire layer of laws of this world and brought the entire layer of laws of this world under his absolute control, it would still take him hundreds of millions of years to achieve this. After slightly estimating this period of time, Luo Fan instead heaved a sigh of relief. It was only calculated in hundreds of millions of years. Fortunately, it was not calculated in billions of years or even tens of billions of years. After all, he had already stayed in this world for more than 8 billion years. For the current him, a time calculated in hundreds of millions of years was nothing, and it was simply a matter of course for him to stay for another hundreds of millions of years, slowly gathering his emotions. He gradually sank into the feeling of the laws of this world being brought into his control more and more in the layer of laws of this world. The layer of laws of this world was completely fused with the great Tao, just like the demon realm. More and more of these laws of this world were brought into his control. Relatively speaking, naturally, more and more of the great Tao of this world were also brought into his control. Moreover, this kind of bringing was a nourishing and silent integration, and did not cause any special fluctuations in the great Tao, nor did it cause any strange phenomenon like a deluge of flowers falling from the sky. And as more and more great Tao was brought into his control, Luo Fan faintly felt that his understanding of the great Tao was starting to deepen. In a trance, he felt as if his own cultivation realm was starting to brew and break through to a higher level. Chapter 1307. There was still a problem with Luo Fan's calculation of time. This time, it did not take him hundreds of millions of years to control all the laws of the world. Instead, it only took him over 80 million years to achieve this. The reason why it was so much faster than he had estimated before was also very simple. It was because as he grasped more and more laws of laws in the law layer, the numerous laws of laws would be of greater help to him in grasping new laws of laws. Thus, the speed at which he grasped the entire law layer would constantly increase. The reason behind this was very simple. The number of nomological laws he had mastered was increasing. Hence, in order to master new nomological laws, he might have to go through 10,000 steps to deduce them using the 4 basic nomological laws. However, by using these nomological laws he had already mastered, he might only need 100 steps to deduce them. In this way, it was obviously a reduction of 9,900 steps. Of course, this greatly sped up his speed. On this day, When Luo Fan completely incorporated the last law into the control of the four halos, Luo Fan suddenly felt a sense of fullness out of thin air. An inexplicable tremor suddenly appeared all over his body. His eyes gradually opened. It's a pity that it's still a little lacking. Luo Fan could not help but sigh after sensing his cultivation realm. Over the past 80 million years, he had always felt that his cultivation was improving, and that the bottleneck he encountered was becoming weaker. But even now, he still discovered that his cultivation was not as strong as before. He was still a level 2 pseudosage. Although he was only a thin layer away from level 3 pseudosage, and it seemed that he could break through it with just a little poke, he was still a little lacking after all. There was no breakthrough at all. In such a situation, how could he not feel regretful? How could he face it indifferently? After all, such an opportunity was extremely rare. If he missed this one, he would have to find another opportunity to continuously improve and grind the bottleneck. He did not know how long he would have to wait. Of course, Luo Fan only sighed for a while. His cultivation of the Tao heart was so strong that it had practically attained an eternally unmoving state. Even though he hadn't obtained a true breakthrough, he'd improved quite a bit now. After thinking for a while, he already understood, and his mentality returned to normal. He carefully sensed the four halos. In an instant, he felt that the entire world was within his grasp. All the laws in this world, even the great Tao, were already completely connected to the four halos. With a single thought, Yi Shiwen's eyes lit up. All the rules and laws of the world, and even the great Tao, would change accordingly. This situation was much better than what he had expected. However, he was quite satisfied. Now I should be able to try and see if I can expand this world. Luo Fan took a deep breath, his heartbeat quickening. The rewards from the third test were not very important to him, and he did not have much expectations for it. However, compared to the rewards after passing the test, Luo Fan was more concerned about passing the test itself. There was no other reason than that he had worked hard for hundreds of millions of years to pass the third test. Just the third test alone. It had already been more than 8 billion years. Not to mention the second test and the first test. The combined length of time had even exceeded an era of the universe on Earth after the shattering of the world. Humans were like this. The more you put in for something, the more reluctant you would be to give it up. Although Luo Fan was already a peak level 2 pseudosage existence, even so, he could not avoid this mentality. He had put in so much effort to pass the third test. Now, he had already unknowingly become reluctant to give up on this test. Now, even if the rewards for passing the test were completely cancelled, he would never give up on passing the third test. It was precisely because of this mentality that Luo Fan, who had already reached the end of the third test and was about to make his last attempt, started to get excited. He actually could not control his heartbeat. After slowly calming his emotions, Luo Fan stretched out his hands. As he moved, the halos behind his head slowly floated between his hands. In a short while, they fell between his hands like a steering wheel and were grasped by his hands out of thin air. As Luo Fan grasped them, the four halos that were originally rotating and circulating shook slightly and stopped the process of continuous circulation. They were directly fixed in place. Endless lights and shadows flashed in Luo Fan's eyes. These lights and shadows were filled with endless lines. These were the truth of the world. It was the scene where the phenomena on the surface of the entire world overlapped with the laws on the back. Then, he exerted a little force in his hands, and the four halos began to rotate. The four worlds within the four halos had undergone a subtle change, and the gaps between the worlds seemed to have been blurred. The four worlds that were originally clearly separated actually showed signs of completely merging into one world. However, this kind of fusion was different from a normal world that had four basic existences. It was like a fusion of sheets of paper overlapping to form a book. In other words, the fusion of these four worlds was an overlapping fusion. Based on this trend, after the fusion of the worlds, they were like a book, forming a form of existence that was both one and clearly separated. The changes in the world inside the halos affected the entire world. As the changes occurred, the entire world shook violently. The shaking was so obvious that even the many exotic beasts in this world instantly discovered it. An indescribable sense of panic was instantly emitted from these exotic beasts, causing the world to suddenly become gloomy and gloomy. At the same time as the emotions of the countless living beings changed, the world's will that was hidden in an unknown place changed as well. As the tremors appeared, the emptiness, desolation, and loneliness emitted by the will of the world gradually disappeared, replaced by a sense of anticipation. An inexplicable sense of panic gradually replaced the three strange existences from before. As the changes occurred, Luo Fan felt an invisible, strange force acting on his hand. This force had no other purpose other than to hinder his movements. This caused Luo Fan to feel an inexplicable resistance towards the changes in the four worlds inside the halos. The source of this invisible, strange force could not be found at all. In fact, even he could not see the nature of this force. However, he immediately knew that this was the resistance of the world, or rather, the inertia of the world. This world had been like this ever since it was created. Even Luo Fan knew that it had been like this for more than 8 billion years. It had already been more than 8 billion years. The direction and method of its development had already become a kind of inertia, an inertia that would continue to develop according to the previous way of development. This kind of inertia caused any action that wanted to change the way the world developed to reverse this kind of inertia. Naturally, there would be an extremely obvious obstruction. This was the reason for the appearance of this invisible, strange force. In the face of this obstruction, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. With this obstacle in his way, he knew that his chances of success had greatly increased. Because this obstruction, compared to what he had expected, this world's obstructive power was much weaker. After all, this world was equivalent to the existence of the demon realm. Compared to this kind of existence, Luo Fan was an ant-like existence. If this world wanted to stop his actions, then the power that was obstructing him could probably completely erase him in the first place. It could even completely erase all traces of his existence in all time and space. It could be done. But now, this kind of obstruction actually only slowed down the speed at which he changed the world inside the four halos. What did this mean? This meant that although this world itself had the inertia of continuing to develop according to the original line of development, it also had the expectation of continuing to develop according to the direction of development after his distortion. In other words, the world itself felt that Luo Fan's changed way of development was better than the original way of development. Only in this way, this kind of obstruction would be much smaller than the original one produced by this world. Even the world thought that Luo Fan could succeed, so how could Luo Fan not have greater confidence in his success? The supernatural power in his body surged and erupted with a power that was enough to completely crush a vast 1,000 worlds into a ball. He resisted the obstruction produced by that world and continued the changes of the four worlds within the halos. After an unknown period of time, a strange soft sound came from the four halos. This soft sound was so mysterious. Although it was a faint sound, it contained endless mysterious power. It directly broke through the barriers of time and space and spread across the entire world, covering an unknown area of billions of light years in this world. In this soft sound, the obstructive force that originally acted on Luo Fan's body suddenly disappeared into thin air. Then, the entire world seemed to have begun to melt. The four basic existences that were originally extremely stable, time, space, matter, and energy, seemed to have become plasticine, as if they could be molded by external forces at will. As such changes occurred, every breath that Luo Fan took agitated the four basic existences around him, causing the space-time around him to seem like it had turned into jelly and trembled. Whether I succeed or not depends on this step. Luo Fan let out a long breath. With a thought, his will followed the fluctuations emitted by the 4 halos and directly swept across the entire world, covering an unknown area of billions of light-years in this world, the unknown height of the sky above, and the unknown thickness of the earth below. Then, with a thought, the entire world began to gradually expand and gradually expand. The distance between the sky and the earth, the area of the 4 continents, the thickness of the earth, the area of the ocean, and even the concentration of the vitality in the void, and so on and so forth, everything continued to increase, and strengthen during this process. Such changes were so mysterious and complicated that even Luo Fan could not help but feel an indescribable sense of shock in the face of such changes. Although these changes came from his hands, the vastness and the supreme power that emanated from it contained countless mysteries of the universe and the mysteries of the great Tao. As he watched all these changes, Luo Fan was in a trance. It was as if he was watching the unfinished process of the birth of the world continue. Vaguely, he seemed to see a supreme existence standing in the center of the world, holding an axe and opening up the world. Amidst this shock, his eyes gradually became vacant. Specks of strange light flickered in his eyes. Every spot of this light seemed to contain the supreme truth that any cultivator would be willing to give up everything to comprehend. She was in a daze, in a trance, and in a daze. Suddenly, a silent joy appeared in Luo Fan's mind. The originally invisible karma suddenly became tangible before his eyes. The originally shapeless and incorporeal karma suddenly became solid before his eyes. In the instant that karma suddenly became tangible, he discovered that the first level of karma, which he had needed to spend a lot of effort to use, had suddenly become instinctive. The difficulties in using the law of cause and effect had become common sense to him. Above that, he had no clue at all. He couldn't find any way to use the second level of the law of causality, but it suddenly became so clear and within reach that he felt as if he could do it with just a slight stretch of his hand. With this inexplicable feeling, Luo Fan slowly stretched out his right hand. He stretched out his hand. He grasped the originally abstract karma in his hand. In an instant, he understood that he'd grasped the second level of utilization of the law of karma. He could already rely on his own strength to directly determine the result without needing a reason. The first level of the law of karma and the second level of the law of karma appeared to be only one level apart. It was as if the only difference was between needing to determine the cause and not needing to determine the cause. But in fact, the difference between the two was like the difference between heaven and earth. In fact, Luo Fan had seen it in the past. Among all the pseudo-sage cultivators that he'd heard of, none of them had been able to advance to the second level of the law of karma. It was the same for level 8 and level 9 pseudo-sage cultivators. This alone showed how difficult it was to master the second level of the law of karma. It also showed how powerful Luo Fan was to be able to master the second level of the law of karma at this time. When Luo Fan felt that he'd completely mastered the second level of the law of karma, he suddenly discovered that the bottleneck between level 2 pseudo-sage and level 3, which had been shackling him, had suddenly disappeared. The third step of the 9 steps below the sage level. He didn't know when he'd arrived at his feet. An indescribable sense of satisfaction and comfort arose spontaneously. At this moment, he felt that everything in him was rising in an unimaginable direction. It only stopped after rising to a level that was hundreds of times his original level. An indescribably powerful aura rushed out of his body and instantly engulfed the entire expanding world. The world seemed to distort slightly at this moment, and all the living beings in it felt as if a supreme existence was suppressing them at this moment. After stepping onto the third step of the 9 steps, he was one step closer to the sage realm. The state of chaos suddenly seemed to become extremely clear and real at this moment. In a trance, He felt as if he could directly enter the state of chaos as long as he took a step forward. "I've finally broken through." An extremely satisfied smile appeared on Luo Fan's face, and he instantly suppressed the urge to step into the state of chaos. He knew very well that this urge was brought about by his sudden great improvement and unprecedented clarity of the state of chaos. It could be said that it was caused by an illusion. If he really stepped into the state of chaos, what awaited him would be the same outcome as his clone back then. All traces of his existence would be completely erased. Even the traces in other people's memories would be the same. He sensed the changes in his body and knew that his improvement had already surpassed the limit of the layer of rune structure that covered his body. If the rune structure did not strengthen further, then when he returned to his flawless state, the special characteristic that would make anyone feel as if they would form a level 3 pseudo-saint soul brand in the depths of his soul would no longer be concealed. Luo Fan only frowned slightly at this point before throwing it to the back of his mind. The rune structure was integrated with the scale of the spiritual kingdom in the demon realm, and the spiritual kingdom was clearly integrating the entire island. Once the spiritual kingdom completed the integration of the entire island, the rune structure's power would obviously continue to increase by another level. At that time, perhaps he would be able to regain the effect of blocking his special characteristic. However, even if there was no way to achieve that effect, Luo Fan did not mind. That would at most bring him some trouble, and compared to the benefits he would obtain, what was it? At this moment the entire world was still constantly expanding, and the process of the creation of the world was still continuing. Compared to the beginning, the current world was already 6 or 7 times vaster. Compared to the beginning, there was already a world of difference between the sky and the earth. Looking at the changes that were taking place in this world, Luo Fan no longer had the mood to continue comprehending it. Chapter 1308. By the time Luo Fan once again reached a flawless and unhindered state, several decades had already passed. Sure enough, as he had expected, when he reached the flawless state of the level 3 pseudo-sage, the rune structure that had concealed the unique characteristics of his flawless state lost most of its effects. Anyone could see his figure and produce a level 3 pseudo-sage brand belonging to Luo Fan in the depths of their soul. Feeling such a change, Luo Fan had a look of helplessness and joy on his face. He felt helpless because the failure of the rune structure had brought him a lot of trouble, but what made him happy was that this flawless state was still as wonderful and powerful as he had expected. After his body had completely reached a flawless state, Luo Fan slightly sensed the changes in the world and found that the world had expanded a lot again. Obviously, everything was going quite smoothly. It was only a matter of time before he reached the number of 10 times that he had expanded. In other words, Luo Fan no longer needed to do anything. As long as he waited quietly, time would naturally push him to the moment when the third round of the test was completed. At this moment, Luo Fan began to get curious. What exactly was the opportunity that could give people the possibility of becoming a sage? Why would it have such power? After getting this opportunity, what kind of sage would he have to do to become a sage? What kind of sage would he be? Would he be a sage like the 54 sages in the demon realm, or the 7 supreme sages in the earth universe? All these doubts began to emerge in his heart, and he couldn't help but look forward to it. At this moment, it was indeed time to consider this question. If he had considered this question before, he would have been biting off more than he could chew. However, if he still didn't consider it now, he would be too heartless and open-minded. Unfortunately, no matter how he thought about these questions, he couldn't find the answers to them. After all, he had only come into contact with the opportunity that could give people the possibility of becoming a sage after participating in the test. He was completely unfamiliar with this opportunity. Under such circumstances, how could he find the truth of that opportunity so quickly? Since they couldn't find the truth behind chance, how could they be sure what would happen after chance became a sage? Would he become a sage like the 54 sages, or would he become a sage like the 7 sages? Time passed slowly as he thought about it. After an unknown period of time, Luo Fan's body suddenly shook. An indescribable feeling came over him. In a trance, he felt as if his entire body and mind had completely merged with a boundless world. This world was more powerful, more terrifying, and more incredible than any world he had seen since he stepped into the Earth universe. Even the demon realm, which had 54 sages, was so small in front of this world. It was so insignificant. This world was obviously the great world that he had worked hard to expand by more than 10 times over these years. As he sensed that this world had completely fused with his body and mind, Luo Fan suddenly understood that he had passed the 3rd round of the test. He had already safely and completely expanded this world by 10 times. Then, he knew that the 4 halos he had obtained had already lost their meaning. With a slight jolt in his heart, the 4 halos shook slightly. They instantly dispersed and became 4 separate, independent halos. They broke away from his control and began to expand crazily in front of him. They crazily filled the entire world and the entire heaven and earth. When the size of the halos expanded to more than 1,000,000 feet, the 4 halos began to collapse at the same time. The 4 halos seemed to be made up of countless tiny light spots. They began to scatter in all directions and gradually spread to every inch of the void in the entire world. They gradually merged with the 4 basic existences in this world: time, space, matter, and energy. Gradually, they merged with everything in this world. Following this change, the entire world began to gradually change. He himself became more and more real, while the world became more and more illusory. At a certain moment, the entire world completely collapsed and disappeared in front of his eyes. It was as if he was the only person left in this universe. Apart from him, everything else seemed to have become an absolutely illusory existence. Everything seemed to have lost all meaning. Then, the illusory world began to gradually shrink and turn into nothingness. The speed and extent of this shrinkage had reached a level that exceeded everyone's imagination. In just a few short breaths, the entire world had directly turned into a halo in front of Luo Fan. It was a halo that was only 3 feet wide and looked like a light mirror. After this halo was formed, it directly stuck to the back of his head. Just like the halo formed by the 4 worlds before, it steadily stopped at the back of his head and slowly rotated in an incredible and mysterious way. Looking at the frequency of its rotation, it contained some kind of indescribable mystery. Under the shroud of this mystery, Luo Fan's entire person seemed to have become countless times more noble, exuding a feeling of being above everything. I didn't expect someone to actually complete the test this time. At this moment, a voice was heard in Luo Fan's ears. This voice was extremely familiar to Luo Fan. It was the voice of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. He looked around again and found that he had already appeared in an inexplicable void. This void was boundless, but it was faintly emitting a faint golden light. This golden light wasn't made of any substance or light. Instead, it seemed to be the color of the void itself. Is this the body of the Buddha? Such a thought flashed through his mind in an instant. When he had this thought, he carefully observed and confirmed his feeling. Sure enough, this was the place he saw every time he passed the test and before the next one. It was the body of a huge Buddha that existed in the center of the platform. The boundless void around him was obviously a world in the body of the Buddha, and it was very likely that it was the scene inside the Buddha. "Senior, how long has it been?" Luo Fan asked. He believed that the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure definitely knew what he was asking. As expected, the moment he asked this question, the voice of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure was heard. 9 years. It has been 9 years since you started participating in the test. 9 years. Luo Fan sighed when he heard this. The more than 8 billion years that he had experienced were only equivalent to 9 years in the outside world. This feeling was so weird that it was indescribable. Even he suddenly felt like he did not know how to react. As Luo Fan sighed, the indescribable shape and color of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure appeared in front of him. It still looked the same as before. There were no abnormal changes. But somehow Luo Fan could feel an inexplicable sense of loss from it, an indescribable sense of loss. After a while Luo Fan said, "Senior, may I ask if I have passed the test? Of course, you have expanded the safety and stability of the primordial world by 10 times. Naturally, you have passed the test," the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure said. "So that world is the primordial world." Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. He had obtained many things from the name, but they were all vague and difficult to describe in words. "Since I have passed the test, may I know where the inheritance of Senior Buddha is?" Luo Fan asked curiously. "That inheritance, didn't you already obtain it?" The level 9 pseudo-sage treasure suddenly said indifferently. Hearing this, Luo Fan instinctively wanted to refute, but he soon realized that the inheritance was the so-called opportunity to become a sage. In other words, the so-called opportunity to become a saint. Could it be the world that he obtained after passing the 3rd round of the test? That light circle? Could it be that Senior is referring to this thing? Luo Fan raised his hand and pointed at the back of his head. Behind his head, the light circle that was emitting gray light was rotating in an extremely mysterious way. A mysterious aura was constantly emitting from it, sweeping the surroundings, causing the extremely wide space around Luo Fan's body to be filled with such mysteriousness. Of course. Do you think that the opportunity is something physical? The level 9 pseudo-sage treasure said indifferently. Hearing this, Luo Fan opened his mouth, but in the end, he could not say anything. That was indeed what he had thought before. After all, the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure had clearly said that after passing the test, he would be able to obtain the inheritance of the Buddhist Supreme and obtain the opportunity to become a sage. Since that was the case, the opportunity and the test should be separated. Of course, after he passed the test, the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure would give him something to obtain the opportunity. However, of course, he could not say such words now. In fact, after the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure said these words, the more he thought about it, the more he felt that this was the only reasonable way. After each of the 3 tests, Luo Fan would obtain something that was extremely difficult to obtain in the outside world, or rather, something that could not be obtained at all. This kind of thing could greatly increase Luo Fan's strength, and make him many times more powerful than before. According to this logic, after passing the 3rd test, he would definitely be able to obtain something that would bring him great benefit. And this kind of harvest would definitely be of a higher level than what he had obtained in the 1st and 2nd tests, and would bring him greater benefit. According to the benefits obtained in the first 2 rounds, the only thing that could be obtained in the 3rd round was that opportunity and that inheritance. That was the only thing that could make sense and conform to the logic of increasing the benefits one could obtain. Is this the opportunity? Luo Fan raised his hand and summoned the halo behind his head to him. He slowly stroked the halo and murmured. After figuring out the reason why this halo was the opportunity, Luo Fan fell into a deeper doubt. Why could this world bring him the possibility of becoming a sage? After thinking for a long time, he still could not find the answer. In the end, he could only look at the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure and ask, "Senior, may I ask how I can become a sage with the help of this item?" The level 9 pseudo-sage treasure did not move, but Luo Fan seemed to feel a sense of contempt coming from it. In an instant, Luo Fan knew that he was being despised by the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. Countless thoughts flashed through his mind. Soon, he knew what mistake he had made, and he could not help but smile bitterly. At this moment, the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure also revealed the answer and said, Do you think I know this? Even my master didn't know how to become a sage with the help of this item, let alone me. Luo Fan sighed and shook his head with a bitter smile. He knew that what the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure said was right. If the Buddhist venerable knew how to become a sage with the help of this item, he would have become a sage long ago. There would be no need to leave behind such an inheritance. There would be no need to set up a test to let people obtain this so-called primordial world. For others to become a sage, even if it was someone close to them, it would obviously not be as easy as becoming a sage himself. Alright, since you have completed the test, the others don't need to go through the test anymore. The others won't need to take the test anymore, the level 9 pseudo-divine treasure said. With that, countless lights and shadows appeared in front of Luo Fan. There were trillions of worlds shown in these lights and shadows, and among those worlds there were more than 1,000 worlds that were slightly lit up. Luo Fan glanced over. He discovered that there was a tester in each of the 1,000+ worlds. Most of these testers were living beings that he had created with the help of the first level of the law of causality. Only a few of them were the dozens of pseudo-sages who had participated in this test with him back then. At this moment, Luo Fan had already passed 3 rounds of tests and became the true successor of the Buddhist venerable, obtaining the inheritance of the Buddhist venerable. His identity was completely different. With a single glance, he could clearly see the test that the more than 1,000 people were undergoing, as well as the progress of the test. The more than 1,000 testers were still in the first round of tests. Those living beings that were created by Luo Fan could not resist the test's shielding of memories. Each of them could only muddle-headedly survive in one world after another, just like the living beings that were born and raised in those worlds. On the other hand, the pseudo-sage existences of different levels were different from them. Even though they could not completely retain all of their memories like Luo Fan and the others, they could more or less retain some of them. However, it was also these preserved memories that made them want to find a way to pass the test in each world. This made them want to find a way to pass the test in each world, thus becoming chaotic. In the end, every world that they had experienced became a cage. It brought them pain. They would only suffer again and again, and they would not be able to obtain the alternative fun that the other 1,000 living beings had. The flow of time throughout the test was the same. In other words, in the past 9 years, Luo Fan had experienced hundreds of millions of years, and they had obviously experienced hundreds of millions of years too. In such a long period of time, they had to change worlds almost every 100 years. Every 100 years, they had to find a way to pass the test in a brand new world. The total number of worlds that they had experienced was calculated in units of millions. If these pseudo-sage existences who participated in the test had their memories intact and their minds intact, they would naturally be able to withstand such a terrifying number easily. In fact, even if all of their memories were sealed, it would not have much impact on them. At most, they would only be reincarnated millions of times. When the final test ended, they would naturally return to normal the moment their memories were completely recovered. However, the worst thing was that they were in neither of these two situations. They had recovered part of their memories, but they could not recover all of them at all. In this way, the memories that they had experienced in each world would unknowingly mix with their own memories. Each time, a small part of their original memories could not be recovered, and a small part of their memories in the previous world would replace that part of their memories, and they would treat it as their own memories. After repeating this for so many times, these pseudo-sage existences had almost forgotten their own selves. In each world, they were just instinctively looking for and testing that world, but they had actually forgotten their purpose of doing so. When Luo Fan saw the changes that occurred to these pseudo-sage existences, he could not help but feel a chill run down his spine. An inexplicable sense of pity welled up in his heart. If a cultivator wanted to cultivate from zero to the pseudo-sage realm, The amount of experience and time it would take would be too much for an ordinary person to bear and cause their mind to collapse. However, such existences had become like this in just a short period of 10 years because of a test. They did not even know if they could recover their own selves after the test ended. How sad was that? The level 9 pseudosage treasure had presided over countless tests, so it was used to such situations. However, they didn't do anything. No one knew what they did, but in an instant billions of worlds collapsed. The more than 1,000 living beings disappeared from those worlds one by one and reappeared in the world where they first saw the level 9 pseudosage treasure. Chapter 1309. After these creatures appeared, they didn't even have time to figure out what was going on around them before they disappeared into thin air. Whether it was the pseudosage cultivators or the creatures created by Luo Fan using the law of karma, they all disappeared. As they disappeared, the world instantly returned to its original appearance. It was impossible to tell that so many powerful cultivators had appeared in this world in the past 10 years, and it was impossible to tell that there had been such a mysterious test there in the past. Luo Fan naturally did not care about the other cultivators, nor did he try to sense where they had gone. However, he was able to sense the living beings that he had created with the help of the law of karma. The moment they disappeared, he knew that the ship had returned to the demon realm with those creatures and reappeared on the vast lake at the center of the island. To other cultivators, this test was just a simple test, but to these creatures, it was equivalent to giving them millions of completely different lives. After experiencing millions of lives, all of the creatures were different from when Luo Fan first created them. All of the 1,000 or so living beings were no longer as muddle-headed and confused as they had been in the past. Every living being had already formed their own worldview and had their own goals to strive for. These creatures returned to a familiar place and found that they were surrounded by familiar figures. At first, they were very confused and did not know what had happened. But soon, they remembered what they had experienced and what they had gained in that extremely special and incredible world. At this moment, the entire ship, as well as the ship itself, fell into silence. In the end, it was the boy who had led the group that spoke. "I want to go into closed-door cultivation. What are your plans, fellow cultivators?" His every word and action had become many times more mature than before. Although his appearance hadn't changed much, the look in his eyes was completely different from before. There was boundless wisdom contained in his eyes, and there was a faint hint of vicissitudes in his eyes. He addressed everyone else as fellow cultivators. He was no longer the same as before. It was clear that the millions of lives he had experienced had a shocking effect on him. If it was in the past, anything he said would naturally cause the beings of the same origin as him to respond in unison. However, at this moment, after he spoke, the scene was filled with indescribable silence. Everyone stood there quietly and looked at each other. The scene fell into silence. After a long while, a creature with the head of a tiger spoke. "I want to see the wonders of the world. Once I achieve the innate Tao body, I will leave this place. I will travel the world." His words seemed to have turned on a switch, and all the living beings present began to express their goals one after another. Among them, their goals were naturally very strange. Some wanted to cultivate, some wanted to travel, some wanted to live ordinary lives, and some wanted to see through everything and adapt to their circumstances. Although there were so many thoughts, everyone knew their thoughts would definitely not change. The thoughts of others could not be changed either. Therefore, after all the different opinions were expressed, the quarrel that should have occurred didn't happen at all. Therefore, after all the different opinions were expressed, the quarrels that should have happened did not happen. Some of them found a place on the lake and used their own special method to build a secluded cultivation place. Some of them left the lake and found a place to live in the mountains around the lake. Some of them even left the area and went to other places on the island. Some of them even left the island directly. Before long, the only thing left in that spot was the strange tree that looked like a big boat. It slowly sank to the bottom of the lake. It was not committing suicide, but it was planning to cultivate, refine its own body, and create a born Taoism form. Then, it would choose its own life. Luo Fan could sense the changes that were happening to these creatures through his connection with them. He could not help but smile faintly. Although he didn't have any deep feelings for these creations, he didn't care much for them. However, they were created by him after all, so he naturally felt different from other creatures. Now that he saw that they had found their own way of living, the worries in his heart were completely gone. While those creatures were telling each other about the lives they wanted, the world that they had just left was undergoing earth-shaking changes. That world began to collapse slowly and gradually turned into a golden Buddha light. It slowly shrank toward a certain place, the place where the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure originally existed. It seemed to belong to the center of this world. The speed of this shrinkage was extremely fast. Just the way it shrank was mysterious beyond imagination. It felt as if everything in this world, including time, space, matter, and energy, seemed to be transformed from the Buddha light. Now, time, space, matter, and energy were all transformed into wisps of Buddha light in an indescribable way. They quickly poured into the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. Looking at this way of transformation, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. Such a change was beyond his imagination. He had stayed in that world for such a long time that he had almost established an extremely close connection with that world. In that world, he had obtained the great power of omnipotence and omniscience. However, even so, he had never imagined that that world was actually the same kind of existence as the worlds of the 4 halos he had created before. They were also constructed using an extremely pure existence, using a mysterious method. They were not natural worlds. At this moment, he suddenly felt more clearly the gap between himself and the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. This was not the gap between strength, but the gap between realms and the method of using energy. It was a gap that almost made people despair. It was like, if someone told you the answer to a math problem clearly and even told you every specific step of solving the problem, no matter what you did, no matter how many strands of your hair turned white, even if you vomited blood, you still couldn't understand it. That sense of frustration was really enough to make one vomit blood. At this moment, what Luo Fan encountered was similar to this situation. One could imagine the sense of frustration. When the world completely turned into a Buddhist light and was completely absorbed by the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure, there was only an extremely strange void left around. It was a kind of absolute nothingness that seemed to be limited by the concept of the void. In this void, apart from the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure, there was no other tangible or intangible existence. Then, there was a flash of Buddhist light. The figure of a huge Buddha appeared in this void. Immediately afterward, Luo Fan felt his body distort, and his position was transferred by an indescribable existence. He directly appeared outside the body of the Buddha and arrived in this void where there was no other existence except for the Buddha and the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. The moment he arrived here, Luo Fan had an indescribable feeling as if his entire body was going to be completely disintegrated and devoured along with this void. It was as if he had completely turned into absolute void. At the same time that this feeling was born, the halo formed by the primitive world behind his head vibrated differently than it should have. Then, he realized that he seemed to have entered a normal space and time. The feeling of absolute nothingness around him was like he was in another world, another space and time. It no longer affected him in the slightest. Could this be the gap between the heavens and the earth? Luo Fan murmured as he looked at the surrounding nothingness. Of course not. When he murmured, the voice of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure was directly transmitted into his ears. The transmission method of this voice was extremely strange, as if it had appeared out of thin air. It did not pass through any space or medium at all. It seemed to appear out of thin air. It was as if it was pouring directly into his ears, but also as if it was directly transmitted into his heart. This place is pure nothingness. It's a void created by my power. The voice of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure continued. Simply creating a void? Then where is this void? Luo Fan asked. Since it's void, where else would it be? Of course, it's nowhere. Nowhere. So that's how it is. Luo Fan was stunned at first, but then he came to a sudden realization and understood. This void was clearly not in any one place, but it could also be said to be in any place. It could be said that it was in the demon realm, in any lesser kiliacosm, or in any greater kiliacosm. It could even be said that it was between the earth and the universe. After all, it was just a void. Alright, enough with the nonsense. Let's proceed with the last inheritance procedure. The level 9 pseudo-sage treasure saw the look of realization in Luo Fan's eyes, but it did not care what Luo Fan had realized. There's still one last procedure? Isn't the inheritance over? Luo Fan frowned. It's just the final icing on the cake. The real inheritance is, of course, over. The level 9 pseudo-sage treasure said. After saying that, without waiting for Luo Fan to react, the Buddha began to move. It held the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure and pressed it towards the back of Luo Fan's head in a way that seemed to be extremely slow, but Luo Fan could not resist or dodge at all. In the blink of an eye, the Buddha's hand had already come into contact with the back of Luo Fan's head. At the same time, the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure was completely pressed into the halo behind Luo Fan's head, which was the primeval world that he had obtained after passing the third test. It was 10 times the size of the demon realm that had just been established. At that moment, a thunderous sound rang out in that world. The thunderous sound was extremely loud, and it contained an indescribable power. Under this sound, Luo Fan felt that even the slightest detail in his body had received a strong shock. He felt like his entire body was about to fall apart and completely disintegrate at this moment. His mind became blank at this moment. All the changes in the outside world and all the changes in time and space, they were completely out of his perception at this moment. After an unknown period of time, when he regained his senses, he found that there was only absolute nothingness left around him. Whether it was the Buddha or the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure, they had completely disappeared. It was as if they had never appeared before. What exactly happened just now? Luo Fan frowned and thought. With a thought, he felt the changes in his body. He could feel the changes in his body. The halo behind his head, which was originally emitting light, had become completely transparent at this moment. On the surface, it seemed like there was nothing behind his head, and there was no so-called halo at all. Such a change was the same as when the 4 halos he had obtained were refined to the limit by the Buddha's light. The situation was the same when they were refined to the limit. However, compared to the 4 halos back then, the halo behind Luo Fan's head at this moment was many times stronger. It also gave him a feeling that it was a lot more vast. Sensing this halo, he even had a vague feeling that he could use this halo to go anywhere. The feeling of doing whatever he wanted to do. As soon as this feeling was born, he gently raised his hand and patted forward, and the absolute nothingness completely collapsed. His figure directly appeared in a world that he was extremely familiar with, the demon realm. Moreover, the place where he appeared was the last place where he had left the demon realm. It was above the lake in the center of the island. He had actually broken the nothingness set up by the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure with a gentle pat and returned to the place he wanted to return to. After returning to the demon realm, Luo Fan carefully sensed and found that the omnipotent feeling had weakened a lot. But it still existed faintly. It felt as if the omnipotent power was restricted by some inexplicable mechanism and could not be fully exerted. With a thought, the entire demon realm seemed to have undergone billions of subtle changes. In the end, the countless subtle changes eventually turned into a result, which was a constantly changing shape. A strange object that could change color at any time appeared in front of him. As soon as this object appeared, it naturally revealed a powerful aura, which distorted the surrounding spacetime, causing a strange spacetime with a radius of 100 miles to appear around this object. This strange spacetime had a strange shape, and it was completely empty inside. There was only an indescribable light in it. Such a strange spacetime wrapped around this strange thing, causing the shadow of a huge golden pill to appear in the sky of the demon realm out of nowhere. At this moment, all the living beings on the lake felt an indescribable fear. This fear was as if something that could crush all of them at any time was suddenly hanging over their heads and could fall down at any time, completely crushing them. As expected, Luo Fan looked at this object with a satisfied smile on his face. This object was none other than a magic treasure. Moreover, it was not an ordinary magic treasure, but a magic treasure that was equivalent to a pseudo-sage treasure. Moreover, it was a half-step pseudo-holy treasure that he had seen before, the level 9 pseudo-holy treasure that was refined by the Buddhist venerable as the prototype. As long as one had the opportunity, as long as one found the method, or even refined the mysteries of the great Tao that the Buddhist Supreme had comprehended, such a magic treasure would naturally evolve and become a true pseudo-sage treasure. It could be said that it was enough to set off a bloodbath anywhere in the world, and it was enough to drive any cultivator who had yet to become a pseudo-sage crazy. However, such a pseudo-sage treasure was created by Luo Fan with just a thought, or to be more precise, this pseudo-sage treasure was not created by Luo Fan, but by the entire demon realm. It was created by Luo Fan using the second level of the law of causality, and with the help of the powerful power of the entire demon realm itself. This method of using the law of causality to create a magic treasure was impossible when Luo Fan's application of the law of causality was still limited to the first level. This was because the first level of application of the law of causality required the definition of cause and effect at the same time. In this way, if Luo Fan wanted to create a magic treasure, he would need to first give an initial and reasonable cause that might eventually lead to the formation of the magic treasure. It was fine for ordinary magic treasures, but if it was a powerful magic treasure, it would not be easy to make the magic treasure take shape. For example, the most common method that Luo Fan used was to raise his finger as the cause to achieve a certain result, but it was difficult to use it to create a magic treasure. It was not because the reason was unreasonable, nor was it because the reason could not lead to the formation of the magic treasure. Instead, it was because the process required to achieve the result of the birth of the Dharma treasure was too long, too tortuous, and too much luck. Unless Luo Fan's cultivation realm could reach a height that he could not imagine at this moment, he would not be able to make this process appear completely and naturally. He would not be able to completely define the cause and effect. However, now that he had reached the second level of application of the law of causality, the situation was completely different. This was because the second level of application of the law of causality did not need to define the cause at all, it only needed to define the effect. In this case, when using the law of causality to create a magic treasure, Luo Fan only needed to define the result of the formation of this magic treasure, and the law of causality would naturally define the cause and process according to this result. Chapter 13:10. This was also the reason why this strange half-step pseudo-sage treasure could appear instantly with a thought from Luo Fan. Luo Fan stretched out his right hand, and the magic treasure fell directly into his hand. After sensing it for a while, and confirming that this magic treasure was indeed a genuine half-step pseudo-sage treasure, Luo Fan smiled slightly and threw the magic treasure into the lake below. This half-step pseudo-sage treasure was tamed in Luo Fan's hands, but the power it possessed was extremely terrifying. After falling into the lake, it naturally began to exert its power. In an instant, the appearance of the lake suddenly changed. From the original appearance of an ordinary lake, it turned into a strange time and space. This strange spacetime was divided by the lake surface. Looking down from the lake surface, it was just an ordinary lake. However, after passing through the lake surface, one would find that it was not ordinary lake water at all, but an extremely strange spacetime. If someone were to enter that spacetime, they would discover that the characteristics of that spacetime could not be described with words at all. Whether it was its size, color, or even the various strange changes that were occurring in it at every moment, they were all the same. This was the terrifying power of this half-step pseudo-sage treasure. Moreover, this was only the power of this half-step pseudo-sage treasure when it was not controlled by its master. Once a living being could master this half-step pseudo-sage treasure, or even go further, if they were not originally cultivators but comprehended the path of cultivation from this magic treasure, once they obtained this magic treasure, they might be able to advance to the half-step pseudo-sage level. If they had the opportunity, it was not impossible for them to advance to the true pseudo-sage level with the help of this magic treasure. The changes in the lake were earth-shattering for the creatures that Luo Fan had created, who were living, cultivating in seclusion within the range of the lake. At this moment, they had all entered a place that was both familiar and strange at the same time. It was familiar because they had just escaped from a place similar to this world not long ago. It was strange because this world was fundamentally different from the world they had just escaped from. For a moment, everyone was at a loss. He was a little anxious. However, they soon felt the benefits of entering this world for their cultivation. All sorts of profound mysteries of the great Tao filled the entire world. That vast and endless energy, the indescribable throbbing that cleansed the heavens and the earth, was extremely beneficial to their cultivations. After not being able to figure out what was going on, these living beings decided to settle down in this world. Just like how they had done in the lake, they worked hard to cultivate and improve their cultivation. They wanted to improve their strength in order to achieve their goals. Luo Fan naturally didn't care about them. He casually pointed, and a boat appeared on the surface of the lake. This ship was not as huge as the previous one, nor was it as mystical. It was just an ordinary ship, as if it was a wooden ship built by an ordinary shipwright. After the ship appeared, Luo Fan's figure gently landed. He landed directly on this boat. Although the surface of the lake had changed due to the half-step pseudo-sage treasure, it had turned into a strange spacetime. However, with Luo Fan's cultivation realm of the level 3 pseudo-sage treasure, how could the power of this half-step pseudo-sage treasure affect him? Under his will, the ordinary-looking wooden boat stopped on the surface of the lake as if it was on an ordinary lake. From the looks of it, there was nothing special about it. As the breeze blew, the wooden boat began to casually float on the surface of the lake. There was an inexplicable sense of comfort and calmness. Luo Fan sat at the bow of the boat and began to close his eyes. He slowly comprehended the halo behind his head. According to the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure, this circle of light was extremely powerful. Even if it was a primitive world, it was also an opportunity to become a sage. However, ever since Luo Fan had obtained this halo, he had not had the time to properly sense its use. He did not know how this halo could give him the opportunity to become a saint. At this moment, he could clearly feel that there was still a period of time before the Ling nation completely unified the entire island. Naturally, it was the best time to comprehend the wonders of this halo. He threw his consciousness into the circle of light. In an instant, he saw a vast and boundless world reflected in his mind. This world was so vast that even when Luo Fan tried to sense it with his mind, he had an indescribable feeling that it was difficult to wrap around it. After all, this world had almost become one with him, and all the changes in it should not be able to escape his senses. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine how vast this world was. Compared to the world that he had expanded before, the current world seemed to be much larger and more vast. Moreover, in this world, in addition to the various strange beasts that originally existed, creatures that looked like connate Taoist bodies were gradually being born. Although Luo Fan had only left this world for a short period of time, this world had already developed for hundreds of millions of years due to the unimaginable flow of time. During this period of time, the creatures that looked like connate Taoist bodies had almost covered every piece of land in this world, including the island. A primitive and crude civilization began to evolve in that world. Luo Fan did not know if it was an illusion, but he vaguely felt that there was an additional aura that belonged to the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure in this entire world. Or rather, to be more precise, there was an additional aura that belonged to a Buddha in this entire world. It was as if at the last moment, when the Buddha suddenly pressed the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure into this world, its aura had already been completely poured into this world. Is it completely integrated? Luo Fan sensed this change, and recalled what the Buddha had done at the last moment. He could not help but reveal a somewhat puzzled expression on his face. It's indeed an inheritance. He was quite understanding of such a change. After all, this was an inheritance that belonged to the Buddha. As a supreme level 9 pseudo-sage existence, the Buddha had even fallen at the last moment of becoming a sage due to a coincidence. One could imagine how unwilling he was. Even under such circumstances, he was able to be open-minded enough to pass down the opportunity to become a sage, so that many cultivators of the younger generation would have the opportunity to obtain his inheritance. It was possible to obtain this opportunity, but how could he really not care about his existence? How could he really not leave traces of his existence behind? At this moment, only these auras appeared in the light circle and in that world. This could already be considered extremely open-minded by the Buddha. If Luo Fan had done it himself, he might have found a way to keep a trace of his spirit so that he could be reborn in the future. This is an open scheme. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He instantly grasped the aura of the Buddha Supreme in this world, and couldn't help but have an epiphany. The aura came from the grade 9 pseudo-sacred treasure. The reason why these auras had tainted the entire world was because of this. It was because the Buddha had completely shattered the level 9 pseudo-holy treasure and integrated every tiny detail of it into the world, becoming resources for the growth of the world. This made the world stronger, more stable, and more mysterious because of the level 9 pseudo-holy treasure. If Luo Fan didn't want this aura, then there was only one way. That was to expel all the power of this grade 9 pseudo-saint artifact. At that time, this world and the halo would probably degenerate to the state when Luo Fan had just passed the 3rd round of the test. Compared to now, it would be countless times worse. This was an open conspiracy. If you want this power, you have to leave behind my aura. If you don't want my aura, you can't have this power. You can choose what you want, Luo Fan sighed, but he didn't expel the aura. Although he wasn't very satisfied with the additional aura, it wasn't to the point where he wanted to expel it. The Buddha Supreme had given him a lot of benefit. In fact, in less than 10 years, he had directly advanced from the grade 1 pseudo-sacred peak to the grade 3 pseudo-sacred peak. No matter how one looked at it, it was not a kindness that could be easily ignored. However, Luo Fan wasn't angry just because the Buddha Supreme had left a bit of the Buddha Supreme's aura in the treasure that he had given him. After understanding this, Luo Fan shifted his attention. How does this world give cultivators a chance to become sages? With this thought in mind, Luo Fan attached his mind to the halo and began to spread his senses using the characteristics of the halo. He carefully sensed the entire demon realm that he was in. The moment he sensed the demon realm with the help of the halo, he discovered the fundamental difference between the demon realm and the primeval world. When he had first entered the third round of the test, which was the primeval world, he had felt that the primeval world was like the demon realm when the world had just been created. Everything there seemed to be no difference from the demon realm. He had even come to this island in the primeval world to confirm whether it was the demon realm or not. However, at this moment, when he sensed the demon realm through the halo, he discovered that the difference between the primeval world and the demon realm was huge. Back then, he had mistaken the primeval world for the demon realm. How wrong he had been! On the surface, the demon realm was similar to the demon realm. It was also a layer of laws that were integrated with the great Tao of this world. It was like the layer of laws was the great Tao, and the great Tao was the layer of laws. Furthermore, both of these worlds were equally vast and boundless. Even their auras felt extremely similar at first glance. However, after experiencing it personally, Luo Fan discovered that the demon realm was more complicated than the primeval world. It was even more mysterious. The auras of the endless cultivators were completely intertwined with the aura of this world, adding millions of subtle and mysterious changes to this world. This was the superficial difference. Apart from this superficial difference, the deeper difference was that the great Tao of this world was completely different from the great Tao of the primeval world. After sensing for a few days, Luo Fan discovered this fundamental difference. He could not help but be shocked. He vaguely felt that this difference might be the fundamental reason why this primeval world could give people the opportunity to become a saint. He had completely eliminated all other distractions and completely focused his attention on the great Tao of the demon realm. Although the great Tao of the demon realm had completely integrated with the layer of laws, it was still a great Tao, and it still existed. It might be difficult to simply sense the great Tao of the entire demon realm. However, it was not impossible. At the very least, for Luo Fan at this moment, if he wanted to sense the great path of the devil realm, he only needed to move his heart, and he could easily sense the existence of the great path, as if he was looking at the lines on his palm. He could directly see the great path of the devil realm turn into an ordinary river flowing in front of his eyes. The great Tao of the demon realm was pure. It was so vast that it was beyond everyone's imagination. Even though Luo Fan had seen countless great Tao of heaven and earth, he was indescribably shocked when he saw this great Tao with his own eyes. The Tao Master Realm was said to be able to condense and materialize the great Tao above the real great Tao of heaven and earth, becoming the supreme great Tao and infinitely close to the saint realm. It was infinitely close to the power of the divine sense of a saint. However, that kind of surpassing and that kind of proximity did not mean that the great Tao condensed by oneself had truly surpassed the great Tao of heaven and earth, and that kind of divine sense of a saint was only roughly close. Compared to a fake saint, that kind of proximity was not enough at all. In fact, this was very natural. Every level of cognition had its own limit. Before becoming an innate Grand Luo, to a cultivator, an innate Grand Luo was only a step away from the saint realm, and was qualified to pursue the saint realm. After becoming an innate Grand Luo, a cultivator would realize that an innate Grand Luo wanted to become a saint. Only by becoming a quasi-life realm could one be considered to be close to becoming a saint. Similarly, after becoming a quasi-saint, one would realize that the Tao Master Realm was the closest to becoming a saint. After becoming a Tao Master Realm, one would also feel that there was a realm above this that was so huge that it was enough to make one despair, standing between them and becoming a saint. Based on this principle, perhaps even a level 9 pseudo-saint would realize that after stepping on the 9th step below the saint realm. In fact, the saint realm was still extremely high up in the sky, waiting for him to climb and cross over. In other words, although the Tao Master Realm was said to have condensed a great Tao above the great Tao of heaven and earth, even a pseudo-saint would not dare to say that the great Tao they condensed and materialized could completely surpass the great Tao of heaven and earth. Therefore, although Luo Fan was already a level 3 pseudo-saint, and the great Tao he condensed and materialized was already above the great Tao of heaven and earth, and was not restricted by the great Tao, he was still inexplicably shocked by the great Tao of the demon realm. With a thought, another supreme great Tao appeared in Luo Fan's eyes. When the two great Tao were placed side by side, the shock was doubled, causing Luo Fan to take a deep breath to suppress the shock. The great Tao that appeared behind was none other than the great Tao of the primordial world inside the light circle. It was also the great Tao that Luo Fan suspected looked like when the demon realm was first established. When the two great Taos were placed together, the difference between the two was clear at a glance. It allowed Luo Fan to see the difference between the two great Taos in an incomparably direct manner. The great Tao was complex and vast, and the number of mysteries contained in it was beyond the limit of description. If an ordinary person saw this great Tao at a glance, it would be impossible for him to comprehend anything from it. Instead, because of the complexity of the great Tao, he would not be able to bear the impact of the information in it. His mind would directly collapse, and he would directly become a walking corpse. In such a vast and complicated great Tao, even if Luo Fan intuitively discovered the difference between the two great Tao, it was impossible for him to completely sort out these differences so easily, and it was even more impossible for him to instantly come to a fundamental conclusion about the reason for the appearance of this difference. What he could do now was to calm down and experience every bit of the mystery of the difference between the two great Tao bit by bit. He quietly comprehended the changes that this difference brought to the demon realm, and then through countless experiences and understanding of the difference, he would find the reason for this change. This was an extremely complicated process. Even if Luo Fan could see these two great Tao directly now, it would definitely not be a process that could be completed in a short period of time if he wanted to truly comprehend these mysteries. Time passed second by second as he continued to comprehend. Before he knew it, another 10 years had passed. During these 10 years, Luo Fan sat at the bow of the wooden ship with his eyes closed. His aura was withdrawn, and he did not reveal any aura or presence at all. Behind him, the world within the transparent circle of light was developing at an unimaginable speed. 10 years, compared to that world, seemed to be tens of billions of years. During these tens of billions of years, all sorts of strange civilizations had arisen and destroyed countless beings with born Taoism aptitudes in that world. Perhaps it was because the Buddha's aura had contaminated the primitive world, or perhaps it was the characteristics of the primitive world itself. In short, among the various civilizations that had been born and destroyed countless times by beings with born Taoism aptitudes, civilizations that belonged to Buddhism and Taoism occupied the majority. Even now, the civilization that occupied the majority of the entire world's civilization was still that of Buddhism and Taoism. Chapter 13:11. During these 10 years, Luo Fan had searched for countless differences between the two great Tao. Today, he had finally sorted out some of them. So that's how it is. After sorting out the information, Luo Fan suddenly felt an indescribable sense of loss and indescribable shock. The sense of loss and shock was because of the source of the difference. It was because he had discovered that if the two great Tao were to be divided in detail, there would be countless differences, causing the two great Tao to be completely different. However, if he were to really trace back to the source, the most fundamental difference between the two great Tao was actually only 54 types. That's right, the most fundamental difference between the two great Tao was that the number of sages in the demon realm was the same. This was obviously not a coincidence. Therefore, in an instant, Luo Fan knew that it was the 54 sages that had caused such an unbelievable difference between the great Tao of the demon realm and the great Tao of the primitive world. This had caused the demon realm to become the demon realm it was today, and not the primitive world of the past. Why did the sages change the great Tao, and how did they change it? If one thought about it boldly, it was easy to guess that the final result of a cultivator becoming a sage would definitely be such a change in the Great Tao. Could it be that this opportunity is to change the Great Tao? Luo Fan looked at the two Great Tao in front of him, and such a thought surged in his mind. However, he quickly dispelled this thought from his mind. This might be a result of a cultivator becoming a sage, but it was definitely not the direct reason. Becoming a sage was definitely not that simple. For a cultivator, it might not be possible to change the Great Tao at the innate Grand Luo realm, but it was no longer impossible when a cultivator's realm was raised to the quasi-sage realm. Even if a cultivator at this level needed to spend a huge amount of energy and countless years to prepare to change the Great Tao, it was still possible after all. In fact, if a cultivator was raised to the pseudo-sage realm, it would be even easier for them to change the Great Tao. For example, the Great Tao that Luo Fan had materialized was already above the Great Tao of the heaven and earth. Although it was only out of his control, with the existence of the Great Tao that he materialized, it would only take a single thought for him to influence and change the Great Tao of the heaven and earth. He only needed to rely on the resonance between the Great Tao. Naturally, it could change the Great Tao of heaven and earth. Obviously, the change in the Great Tao was not the direct reason for becoming a saint. Since the opportunity passed down by the Buddhist Supreme dared to claim that it could give one a chance to become a saint, it meant that the opportunity was definitely not that simple. It would not just give people the opportunity to change the Great Tao. There must be a deeper level of change, and there must be a deeper level of mystery within. But now, Luo Fan discovered that the total number of changes to the Grand Tao had already reached his limit. He wanted to follow these changes to find out what had caused these changes, and how the existence that caused these changes allowed cultivators to become sages. That was obviously beyond the scope of his strength. Understanding this, Luo Fan sighed. He slowly dispersed the two Great Taos in front of him. It seems like it's about time, he thought to himself as he slowly stood up. At this moment, the power of the rune structure on his body had already risen to an unimaginable level. It had completely covered up the special characteristics that he had after becoming flawless. It would no longer allow others to form a level 3 pseudo-sage imprint that belonged to him in the depths of their souls the moment they saw him. This situation had only happened in the past 1 or 2 years. In the past 1 or 2 years, the flawless characteristics of Luo Fan could not be completely covered up at all. This caused many living beings around him to form a level 3 pseudo-sage imprint that belonged to Luo Fan in the depths of their souls. Fortunately, most of these living beings were created by Luo Fan with the use of the law of cause and effect. There were no living beings that were truly strong enough to threaten him. Therefore, it did not affect him too much. It could only be regarded as a rare opportunity for many other living beings to cultivate. It was also because of the changes in the rune structure that Luo Fan was able to comprehend the difference between the two Great Tao. He could sense the development of the situation on the entire island, which allowed him to wake up in time. In fact, after more than 20 years, the integration of the Ling nation had begun. At this time, it had already come to an end. Now, almost the majority of living beings on the entire island had already recognized themselves as belonging to the Ling nation. The original numerous countries on the entire island had also gradually integrated into the Ling nation. The emperors and subjects of those countries had gradually changed the traditions that had lasted for a long time, and gradually got used to being a part of the great Ling nation. In Luo Fan's senses, the emperor of the Ling nation had already decided to hold a sacrificial ceremony in a few days to announce to the world and the heavens that this island had been completely unified. The Ling nation had become the only nation on this island that had only appeared a few times in the billions of years since ancient times. Obviously, according to the news that he had learned from sect master Xianwen of the Azure Temple, when the emperor of the Ling nation worshipped the heavens and announced to the heavens that the Ling nation had unified the entire island, It was obviously the time when the test of an unknown sage would descend. At that time, this island would face the attack of an island that was exactly the same as this island. At that time, Luo Fan would also encounter the attack of a cultivator that was exactly the same as him, like his clone. At this time, although Luo Fan no longer needed to use such pressure to break through the bottleneck of level 1 pseudosage, he still did not change his original plan. He did not stop the Ling nation from truly unifying the entire island, nor did he think of a way to avoid a battle with his clone. The reason for this was very simple. Because this matter had already become a burden in his heart. If he avoided the battle at this time, it would definitely have some impact on his mind. Although it would not affect the improvement of his cultivation in the future, it would increase his fear of the sage. It would further reduce his chances of becoming a sage in the future. Even if that chance was already extremely small, there was still hope after all. Letting Luo Fan add some dangers to himself at this time because of the small hope, and instead reduce the hope once again, he was naturally unwilling to do so. This was also the reason why Luo Fan was unwilling to change his plan at this time, even if he no longer needed to use the same battle with himself to stimulate himself and break through the bottleneck of the peak level 1 pseudo-saint and become a level 2 pseudo-saint. After a few days, suddenly there was a thunderclap in the sky. Then, a loud voice suddenly sounded from a certain location on this island. The voice was ordinary when it first appeared, but the more it sounded, the stronger the terrifying power contained in the voice became. In the end, it even shook the heavens and the earth, making it seem as if this voice was the only thing left in the entire world. In the past, I was ordered by the heavens to be a ruler. On behalf of the heavens, I supported Qianli, Yiluan Yu, well rope, and I have inherited it to this day. The people have many blessings, and I will not forget to repay them. This funeral oration was simple and desolate, as if it had been passed down from an endless period of time. It was as if the voices of countless emperors of the Ling kingdom were mixed together and resounded through the heavens and the earth, causing all living beings who heard this to involuntarily feel a sense of awe and holiness that emanated from the bottom of their hearts. Amidst this funeral oration, the thunderclap in the sky became louder and louder, and the originally cloudless sky suddenly began to condense and accumulate traces of black fog out of nowhere. This black fog, it became thicker and thicker. At first, it was just black fog, but when the funeral oration was about to end, the black fog had condensed into a boundless dark cloud that completely covered the vast sky above the island. This dark cloud was so huge that under its cover, the entire world seemed to be completely covered. At this moment, every place on this island seemed to have fallen into the deepest layer of the night. Unless one could see things without light, no one could see anything, not even their own fingers. This strange change was like the entire island and everything above and below it. At this moment, it was completely devoured by some unbelievable existence. This kind of change was a shocking upheaval for all the creatures on the island who were not mentally prepared. It caused them to suddenly feel an inexplicable sense of panic. It was as if a calamity was right in front of them, but they still did not know what kind of calamity it was. They did not know what kind of inconceivable thing had happened to cause such a terrifying scene to appear at this moment. For the Ling Kingdom's emperor and the other living beings and cultivators who already knew what was going to happen, this change was so obvious that they finally confirmed that the ancient legend was actually true. It let them know what kind of tragic battle they were about to encounter. Compared to other living beings, Luo Fan had been comprehending the great Tao of the demon realm for the past 10 years. At this moment, he had a much closer understanding of the demon realm than before, and he saw many more things than other cultivators and living beings. In his eyes, the dark clouds in the sky were not dark clouds at all, but a space-time, a world. That space-time, that world, did not exist in a normal way. Instead, it was like building blocks that were being built according to the island bit by bit, piece by piece. He could even see that in that space-time, the earth was taking shape, the mountains were rising, the valleys were sinking, the rivers were opening up, and the grassland was beginning to flourish. These were considered normal for Luo Fan. Even if it was him, he could easily create these things. Even though the level of perfect replication might not be comparable to the world above, there wouldn't be too much of a difference in essence. What shocked Luo Fan was the endless living beings that were being born and being formed above. Whether it was the emperor or the beggar, whether it was the rich merchant or the official, whether it was the frail scholar who didn't even have the strength to truss a chicken, or the powerful martial artists who could tear tigers and leopards apart, or even the powerful cultivators who could live forever, or even the one that gradually appeared in the center of the island, an existence that Luo Fan was extremely familiar with, another Luo Fan. After the other Luo Fan appeared, he also looked up at the sky. Even his expression was the same as Luo Fan's at this moment, as if Luo Fan was looking at a mirror. The means of a sage. Is this the means of a sage? Luo Fan only had this thought in his mind as he looked at the incredible changes that were happening above his head. It was extremely easy for Luo Fan to open up a world and create living beings. In fact, he could even create countless worlds with just a raise of his hand or a move of his foot. He could create billions of living beings. However, to create a cultivator, to create a false sacred realm cultivator, was impossible for him. Given Luo Fan's strength, he could really create a pseudo-sage treasure that was half a step away from being a pseudo-sage. He could only do it not long ago when he had just comprehended the second level of the law of karma. Not to mention pseudo-sage beings. However, at this moment, all living beings appeared in the sky at the same time. The way and speed of the clone of Luo Fan appeared. It was exactly the same as the way and speed of the ants up there. From the looks of it, it was as if Luo Fan and that ant were on the same level of existence. Luo Fan obviously could not understand such a change at all. Although he had seen the entire process clearly, when all the changes were finally completed, he realized that he could not understand a single thing at all. What did he think about the appearance of the island before he saw it? Right now, he was still thinking the same thing. He still had the same idea of what mysteries were contained in that change. He didn't have a deeper understanding just because he had seen the whole process clearly. In such a situation, he could only lament that this was the means of a sage. There's the law of karma. There's the great Tao. There are countless things that can't be described or classified. He thought to himself, and a wry smile gradually appeared on his face. The speed at which the world in the sky was being constructed was beyond imagination. When the island emperor's sacrificial rites sounded, it gradually appeared. However, when the hundreds of words of sacrificial rites disappeared completely, the world in the sky was already formed. A world that completely replicated everything on the island had been formed. The moment the world was formed, the dark clouds in the sky trembled slightly and dissipated into thin air. The moment the dark clouds dissipated, everyone on the island suddenly understood that they were no longer in the original world. They had entered a trial that belonged to a sage. This trial was incomparably difficult. What they needed to do was to defeat an island that was exactly the same as theirs, a creature that was exactly the same as all of them. As long as they passed this trial, they would be qualified to go to the center of the world, to the 4 continents, and become a disciple of one of the 54 sages in the world. From then on, they would have a future that was millions of times brighter than what they had now. They might even have the opportunity to receive teachings from a sage in the future. However, if they were unable to pass this trial, then what awaited them was death. They had only appeared a few times since ancient times. The unification of the island would collapse once more, and the world would return to its original state of chaos. Of course, this might not have anything to do with them by then, because their souls might have been destroyed in this trial, never to be reincarnated. It's finally here. Luo Fan let out a long sigh. At this moment, the dark clouds above had already disappeared, and the world that was exactly the same as this island that was revealed in the dark clouds had also disappeared. However, Luo Fan clearly knew that that world had not disappeared. Instead, the entire island that he was on had entered that world, and that island was currently not far away from this island, preparing for a battle of life and death with this island. At this moment, a strange prayer was transmitted into Luo Fan's ears through a mysterious connection. When Luo Fan heard this, he knew that it was the Ling nation's emperor, the god of heaven, and the others asking him what he should do. With a thought, Luo Fan took a step forward and his figure disappeared from this ordinary-looking wooden ship. When he reappeared, he had already traversed the long void and appeared directly on the capital of this island, which was also the capital of the Ling nation. Of course, this was no longer the capital of the Ling nation when it was just a small country at the border. This was a place that was neither too far nor too close to the center of the island. Looking down at the capital, Luo Fan discovered that not only was the entire capital huge, but it was also vast beyond imagination. Moreover, the entire capital was so prosperous that even he could not help but exclaim in admiration. Compared to the current capital, the former capital of the Ling nation was like a small mountain village with only a few families. Unfortunately, at this time, the entire capital was shrouded in an extremely ominous atmosphere. To be more specific, it was an extremely depressing and despairing atmosphere. Chapter 13:12. Luo Fan did not conceal his arrival. As soon as he arrived above the capital, hundreds of senses scanned his location. Of course, even though Luo Fan did not conceal his arrival, with Luo Fan's power, these cultivators could not see him clearly. Even if their perception swept over the place where Luo Fan was, what they finally saw was only an incomparably powerful ball of light. The brightness of this light was enough to stun any cultivator. Some cultivators, due to their insufficient cultivation base, were blinded by the terrifying light the moment they scanned Luo Fan. It took them a lot of effort to recover. When they saw Luo Fan clearly, the entire capital lined up in a solemn procession at an unimaginable speed. At this moment, the entire capital completely lost its original depressing and despairing atmosphere. Instead, it was replaced with hope and an inexplicable sense of joy. Tens of thousands of cultivators rose from the capital and formed a long, radiant path in the air that exuded boundless nobility and majesty. It extended all the way to where Luo Fan was. Next, the heavenly gods, the sacred beings, and the others followed the Ling Kingdom's emperor and quickly arrived before Luo Fan. Even the Ling Kingdom's emperor, who was the spokesperson of the island during the worship ceremony and ruled over billions of lives on the island, was extremely obedient at this moment. He directly bowed to Luo Fan. After a great show of extravagance, the Ling Kingdom's emperor finally invited Luo Fan to the palace. Luo Fan looked at this extravagance that could move ordinary people to tears, but he only showed a faint smile on his face. He was not affected at all by this extravagance. Of course, he could not be bothered to stop them either. He only watched quietly. When the Ling Kingdom's emperor asked Luo Fan to go to the palace for a discussion, Luo Fan shook his head and said, "Forget about going to the palace. You asked me to come this time to ask how we should deal with the upcoming matters, right?" "That is indeed so," the heavenly deity and the others said in unison. Although the status of the Ling Kingdom's emperor was different, in Luo Fan's heart, the position of the Ling Kingdom's emperor was far inferior to that of the heaven gods and the others who had some kinship with him. That was exactly why. Even though the emperor of the Ling Kingdom had become the emperor of the entire island. Among these people, his status was the lowest. When it came to proper business, it was naturally not his turn. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "I already know about this matter. With the current situation, that's what I wanted." Hearing Luo Fan's words, everyone's expression changed. Such a fact. They had already guessed it, but after all, they still had some wishful thinking in their hearts. Now that Luo Fan directly asked this question, they finally confirmed this point, but for a moment they did not know how they should feel about it. At this time, they already knew what kind of dangerous situation the entire island was about to encounter. It was very likely that all the living beings on the island would be completely wiped out in the near future. Even for them, it was very likely that their bodies and Tao would vanish, and their souls would scatter. From then on, their existences would be completely erased. Under such circumstances, of course, they could not be happy about the current situation. However, at the same time, the great existence in front of them took the initiative to create such a situation. It was unlikely that he was going to send them to their deaths. He must have made arrangements, and there must be a way for them to survive this danger. This gave them an inexplicable sense of hope amidst the pressure. There was even an indescribable sense of anticipation. If the existence before them really had a way, could it be that he could allow the island to obtain great benefits under such circumstances? All these emotions intertwined together, causing their expressions to become a little strange. How intelligent was Luo Fan! He could see through their thoughts at a glance, but he was too lazy to care about them. He smiled and said, "In this sage trial, you will encounter an attack from an island that is exactly the same as this island. If you can defeat that island, you will be qualified to join the sage's army, and from then on, you will be able to fight for the sage. Although the danger will be greatly increased, you will also obtain indescribable opportunities and great benefit. If you can't defeat that island, everything will be over. It is very likely that all the living beings on this island will be completely wiped out, and all the cultivators will be killed. What should we do? Please give us some pointers, Immortal," the heaven deity said carefully. He already knew about these things. As soon as Luo Fan said it, he naturally understood it completely, and there was no need for him to continue explaining. However, what he wanted to know was how to do it. "What do you think about joining the sage's army?" Luo Fan smiled faintly. "Although joining the sage's army will allow you to obtain greater opportunities, because the opponent is also a sage's army, I think the danger will be greater. Selfishly speaking, I think it's better not to join," the heaven deity said. "What about you?" Luo Fan smiled faintly and asked the others. The others looked at each other. Their views were similar to the heaven deities. They also felt that joining the sage's army was too dangerous, and they were also unwilling to do so. The reason was very simple. They were very clear about their own capabilities. On this small island, they could still do whatever they wanted, but on the 4 central continents of this world, under the sage's army, they would definitely become cannon fodder. As for cannon fodder, how could they, who were extremely familiar with war, not know what kind of fate it was? That's right, opportunities did exist. Those cannon fodder could indeed allow them to obtain endless benefits under the effect of some amazing luck. They could be promoted and become rich, or obtain some treasures, or even raise their cultivation realm to an extremely high peak. However, among the 10,000 cannon fodder, there might not even be one who would obtain such an opportunity. These people had such self-awareness, so how could they be so arrogant as to think that they were less than 1 in 10,000? Everyone could clearly see each other's thoughts, and for a moment, they all heaved a sigh of relief. Then, the divine and the others all bowed to Luo Fan and said, "We all think so too." Luo Fan looked at them and nodded, saying, "Since you have no intention of joining the sage's army, then it's simple. Apart from those who are willing to go to the island with me to challenge the clone, everyone else will stay on this island. When the 2 armies clash, just directly surrender." Surrender? These words caused everyone's expressions to change. After a long while, only then did they come to a sudden realization. It turned out that it was that simple. Although the sage's trial was dangerous, it obviously did not aim to exterminate all of them. In such a situation, this trial Naturally, it did not need to kill all of them to be considered a failure. And it did not need to kill all of them. Then, it could be decided by one side surrendering as the condition of victory. Since it was decided by one side surrendering as the condition of victory, admitting defeat after being beaten to a half-crippled state or admitting defeat without even fighting at all would also determine the outcome of the battle. What was the difference in the outcome? Under such circumstances, as long as they were not willing to join the sages, they could directly face the enemy and admit defeat before they suffered any damage. This was clearly the best choice. There were so many of them, but the reason they hadn't thought of this before was because they were stuck in a dead end. In other words, it was because the supreme prestige of the sage had brought them a strong and unparalleled spiritual pressure, blinding their minds. During this process, they did not even think about the possibility of directly giving up. Instead, they painstakingly completed the trial of the sage and wholeheartedly wanted to pass this trial. The possibility of directly surrendering had been subconsciously eliminated from their minds from the very beginning. Hearing Luo Fan say such a simple solution to the problem, everyone couldn't help but smile. The despair and fear that had been lingering in their hearts had unknowingly disappeared without a trace. In an instant, the atmosphere had become relaxed. "All right, since you've understood. Then I'll give you 3 days. 3 days later, I'm willing to challenge the island. Those who are willing to duplicate themselves, come to the lake in the center of the island to meet me," Luo Fan said calmly. After saying that, he couldn't be bothered with them. He lifted his foot and took a light step forward. In an instant, he had traveled tens of thousands of miles and arrived at the center of the lake where he had stayed for a long time. He appeared directly at the bow of the wooden boat. He didn't explain too much and only stated his arrangements. However, he believed that all of them should know what he meant and what he wanted to do. If there were actually cultivators who couldn't understand what he meant from his words, then their countless years of cultivation would have all been in vain. As for why he said it to be 3 days later, it was because he knew that it would take at least 3 days for the news to spread and for them to gather at the center of the lake. By then, Luo Fan didn't care how many cultivators would come. In any case, he had let those cultivators go to the island with him because he was giving them a chance. It was a blessing that he spread. Whether they went or not was up to them. After all, 3 days was something that Luo Fan could afford to lose. In this trial space, time flowed many times faster than the outside world. With such a fast flow of time, it was obvious that this trial would take a long time to complete. In such a long time, Luo Fan still had the patience to spend 3 days spreading his blessings. As for whether the other island would send an army to attack this island and start the real trial, Luo Fan wasn't worried at all. Mobilizing the power of an island, even if it was the power of a duplicate island, was definitely not a simple matter. Let alone 3 days, even if it took them 3 years to truly mobilize and attack this island, Luo Fan would still praise them for being fast and efficient enough. During these 3 days, Luo Fan had been quietly sitting and adjusting his breathing. As for the many cultivators who received Luo Fan's words, they fell into a bitter torment. Just as Luo Fan thought, almost all the cultivators understood Luo Fan's meaning and what Luo Fan wanted to do. They also knew that Luo Fan was giving them an indescribable blessing. However, not every single one of them was willing to accept this opportunity and fortune. Fighting against a clone that was exactly the same as him was simply throwing away half of his life. His chances of survival were very low. It was almost 50% to Luo Fan, who had absolute confidence in himself. Such a huge chance of death was naturally nothing. However, to the many other cultivators, it was enough to make them retreat. In the end, in Chapter 1322, everything was the same. It almost made people suspect that Luo Fan had just circled around and returned to the island. Is this the island? Apart from Luo Fan, this was the first time all the cultivators saw the duplicate island. Previously, the island was constructed among the dark clouds in the void. However, apart from Luo Fan, who could see through the dark clouds and clearly see the process of the island's construction, no one else could see it at all. To them, when the Ling nation's emperor's sacrificial rites sounded, the dark clouds filled the sky. When the sacrificial rites ended, the dark clouds dissipated, and everyone knew that they had to participate in a terrifying trial. Even a heavenly god had a look of disbelief when he saw the island. "It's really exactly the same," he murmured, and a bitter smile gradually appeared on his face. The more he cultivated and the stronger he became, the more he realized how weak he was, and the more he realized how long the path ahead of him was. To him, everything on the island in front of him was completely different from the island he had stayed on for so long. If he didn't know that Luo Fan wouldn't lie to them, he would definitely think this was the island. However, the entire island only appeared for a short period of time after the sacrificial rites sounded. What kind of unbelievable power was that, and what kind of shocking mystery was contained within it? All of this was a riddle to him, and he couldn't even imagine it. Therefore, how could he not feel bitter? Even a heavenly god was in such a state, and the highest cultivation level of the others was only on par with him. Their performance was even more obvious, and they looked even more pathetic. They were almost out of their wits. Luo Fan naturally didn't care about them. He didn't stop anywhere on the island. Instead, he headed straight for the center of the island where the lake was. In other words, he headed straight for the place where his clone embodiment was waiting. There was no need to elaborate on his speed. Almost as soon as everyone finished sighing, he had already traversed more than half of the island in the span of a few dozen breaths. Ignoring all the burdens, he arrived at the lake, where he saw the wooden boat in the distance. He saw an extremely familiar, yet somewhat strange, existence standing quietly on the wooden boat. One was also a flawless third-level pseudo-saint, also had his own unique worldview, also grasped the second level of the law of causality, also had the memory of 3 perfect worlds, and was also a great existence from the age of chaos. The other Luo Fan. When the two of them met, a faint smile suddenly appeared on the other Luo Fan's face, and he said, "You really took the initiative to come." When Luo Fan heard this extremely familiar voice saying these words that didn't come from his mouth, he suddenly had an inexplicable strange feeling. He stopped and stayed in midair, facing the other Luo Fan from afar, and said, "Although you aren't me, you came from the means of a sage. I think your clone of me is deep enough. It's only normal that you can guess what I'm thinking. If you can't guess it, then I'll have to doubt the quality of this sage trial. Not bad, not bad. I feel very lucky to be able to become your clone. Thanks to you, I know that the chaotic state is so exciting," the other Luo Fan said. As soon as he said this, Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. Although this person was completely copied according to him, and at the moment of birth, he was indeed exactly the same as him, he was not the real him. At the moment he was born, he was already fundamentally different from him, and had become a completely different person. It was just that this person had his memory, his cultivation, and the power of his magical powers. And when this person said that, Luo Fan also knew what he was referring to. He was obviously referring to all kinds of information about the primordial world, the great Tianyuan world, and even the great Jili world. "You must be relieved now. You feel that I'm not you, so you feel less psychological burden. You feel that killing me next will not bring you any psychological pressure, right?" the other Luo Fan said with a smile. Indeed. Luo Fan didn't deny it. Chapter 13:13. The other Luo Fan looked at the other cultivators on Luo Fan's auspicious cloud and said, "Are these people here to challenge themselves? Apart from this, what are they doing on this island?" Luo Fan chuckled. The two of them did not seem like they were going to fight to the death. Instead, they were like two best friends. There was no awkwardness in their conversation, and they were even smiling. "In that case, I'll give them a hand." The other Luo fan smiled faintly. As he spoke, he raised his hand and made a grabbing motion in front of him. In an instant, an invisible wave spread out from his hand, instantly engulfing the entire island. It directly grabbed a certain existence that was in over 100 locations on the island that were separated by an unknown distance. The entire process was extremely mysterious and profound. Among the people present, apart from Luo Fan, who could clearly see the mysteries he used during the process, the other cultivators could only see the same incomprehensible means that Luo Fan had displayed when the island was formed. Apart from that, they did not gain anything. Then, among the over 100 people present, each of them disappeared on Luo Fan's auspicious cloud. When they reappeared, they were already in a special space-time. And in this special space-time, apart from them, there was another existence that was the same as them. This existence had a faint aura that made them feel like they were looking at a mirror. This was very obvious. It was their duplicates. It was the other Luo Fan who had opened up over 100 spacetimes and worlds in the blink of an eye. He had thrown the duplicates of the cultivators into those worlds with them. His intention was obviously to have them fight their duplicates fiercely in those worlds. After the other Luo Fan was done, he smiled and said to Luo Fan, "Is this okay?" Luo Fan chuckled. He took a step forward and arrived on the wooden boat, standing less than 10 feet away from the other Luo Fan. He said, "That's right. If I do it, it is the same." What he said was not a lie. If he was the one doing it, he would directly throw the cultivators and their clones into a separate world and let them fight on their own. There would be no bias. He wouldn't use any special methods to plot against the clones. He wanted to create some conditions for the cultivators who came with him to win. To him, those cultivators were simply too weak. It felt like participating in the battle between them was like two children fighting. Once a martial arts master saw it, he immediately joined the fight. This was what he thought. The other Luo Fan was his clone. Although it was not the real Luo Fan and was quite different from him, his way of thinking should not be too different. "What about us? How do you plan to fight? Are we going to fight here?" Another Luo Fan asked. "Fight here? If you want to destroy this island, you can do that." Luo Fan naturally shook his head and said. Luo Fan was now a level 3 pseudo-sage. When such an existence erupted with power, even a world would not be able to withstand it. Although this island was large and it was a trial ground built by the sage, it was still impossible for it to withstand his power. Under such circumstances, if the two Luo Fans were to start a fierce battle here, then the final result would be very obvious. The island would be wiped out by the aftermath of their battle. All the living beings on the island would disappear completely, and even the entire island would be flattened in an instant. This was not what Luo Fan or the other Luo Fan wanted to see. The reason why the other Luo Fan did not want to see was simple. After all, he was created by the sage. After the sage created him, he gave him the responsibility to defeat the other island together with this island. If this island was erased because of their battle, how would they take responsibility for it? The reason why Luo Fan did not want to see this was even simpler. If he wiped out this island, then who would he use the method of directly surrendering during the battle that he had previously set? Without a target to fight, was he supposed to surrender to the air? If he could not surrender, did that mean he had to join the sage and fight for the sage? Luo Fan and his clone had the same memories and the same power. Naturally, the two of them were very clear on what they were thinking. It was because they knew each other very well. That was the reason why the two of them were so peaceful and coexisting so harmoniously. Luo Fan did not have to worry that the other party would do something he did not want to see, and the other party did not have to worry that Luo Fan would start a massacre. "Let's each create a world," Luo Fan said with a smile after thinking for a while. The other Luo Fan knew what Luo Fan meant in an instant and smiled. "That's good too. We don't have to fight to decide the winner." "It's a pity. If you could really exist for a long time, maybe we could become good friends. Luo Fan sighed. Conversing with this other version of himself was like conversing with someone whose heart and soul were connected to his. Even the slightest change in expression or change in language could be instantly understood by the other party. This kind of feeling, even for him, gave him an inexplicable sense of satisfaction, and he felt completely relaxed. This is only temporary. If I can exist for a long time, as time goes by, the difference between the two of us will become bigger and bigger. At some point, we will really become two completely different people. At that time, this feeling of being connected to each other will never appear again. So, there's nothing to regret. The other Luo Fan sighed. Obviously, he also felt a little regretful. For this kind of thing, Luo Fan thought for a while and already understood. It determined a living being's temperament and thoughts. Apart from the natural foundation of living beings, it was also the many encounters of living beings. No matter how firm a person's Taoist heart was, as they experienced more and more things, their temperament and thoughts would unknowingly change. So, even if the current Luo Fan and his clone were completely the same, as they experienced more and more different things, when they were in different positions for a longer period of time, their temperament and thoughts would naturally diverge. In the end, they would become two completely different individuals. They would no longer have anything in common. This was an inevitable trend of development. Even if this trend might take a very long time, only then could it develop to a completely different stage. After sighing for a while, the two of them restrained their emotions at the same time. They raised their hands and pointed forward. In an instant, 4 mysterious existences rushed out from their hands. These 4 mysterious existences, they were the 4 basic existences of time, space, matter, and energy. After they were created by the 2 Luo Fans, they began to construct in front of them. From nothing to something, from simple to detailed, they gradually constructed 2 worlds. Obviously, the world creation method they had used was not an ordinary one, like the one they had used to casually create over 100 worlds. Instead, it was the most detailed and profound world creation method they had comprehended when passing the Buddha Supreme's test. Compared to casually creating a world with a finger, this method was more complicated, mysterious, and required more skills. But at the same time, the world constructed in this way had a great advantage in terms of level compared to the world that was randomly created. As long as Luo Fan was capable enough and spent enough time, he might be able to directly construct a world that was infinitely close to a perfect world. Of course, even if it was infinitely close to a perfect world, it was not truly a perfect world. The slightest difference determined that the world they created could not be truly equal to a perfect world. It could not be truly formed in a state of chaos. It determined that the world was still a vast thousand world. Even if it was a vast thousand world that was countless times more powerful than an ordinary vast thousand world, it was still a vast thousand world. Therefore, it was impossible to rely on this method to directly obtain the ability to survive in a state of chaos after the destruction of the Earth's universe and obtain the same characteristics as a sage through another method. More importantly, even if he wanted to create a world that was infinitely close to a perfect world, it would still take a terrifying amount of time for the current Luo Fan. It could be calculated in tens of billions of years, or even hundreds of billions of years. In the beginning, the 2 Luo Fans' method of creating the world was extremely synchronized. It was like the inside and outside of a mirror. Seeing the construction of one world, one could guess the construction of the other world. However, with the passage of time, the 2 worlds gradually deviated from one another. Even if they had the same memories, the same magic power, and the same cultivation, they were 2 different people after all. The difference between them caused the 2 of them to gradually develop different thoughts and different inspirations through different experiences. Naturally, the world that they constructed would also deviate accordingly. At this moment, Luo Fan did not care about what the other Luo Fan was doing at all. He focused all his attention on the world in front of him. Time, space, matter, and energy. These four basic existences were changing, intertwining, twisting, and combining crazily under his control. Gradually, they constructed all the existences needed for a complete world. He directly used these four basic existences to create a world. This was a method of constructing a world that he had comprehended after passing the 3 rounds of the Buddhist Supremes test. Most of the mysteries used were actually what he had considered when he passed the 2nd round of test, and they were also what he had used in the 4 strange worlds. For Luo Fan, constructing the world in this way was equivalent to constantly scooping out buckets of water from a reservoir. The mysteries used were simply a very small part of the mysteries that he had mastered. And it was precisely because this was only a very, very small part of it that Luo Fan was able to generate countless inspirations through continuous association, continuously integrating more and more mysteries into the process of creating the world, causing the world to become more and more mysterious. It became more and more stable, stronger and stronger, and its level also became higher and higher. In the beginning, when the world was barely formed and had all the existences of a normal world, it was just a minor kiliacosm. However, as time passed, after an hour, it had already been upgraded to the level of a minor kiliacosm. After another hour, it had been upgraded to the level of a minor kiliacosm. At the beginning, in the minor kiliacosm, the worlds created by the 2 Luo Fan were basically exactly the same. They both looked like a vast universe. However, when that world was upgraded to the level of a minor kiliacosm, the worlds created by the 2 of them were different. This difference caused the stars between the 2 universes to appear. There was a big difference. The number of planets with life appeared. There were also more and less of them, and there were many similarities and differences in their positions. When the 2 worlds were upgraded to the level of a minor kiliacosm, the difference was huge. It was so huge that the 2 worlds had already become 2 completely different universes. Even the prevailing civilizations between the 2 universes had become completely different. The one created by Luo Fan was a prevailing civilization of cultivation, while the other one created by Luo Fan was a civilization of science and technology. However, despite these similarities and differences, the level of the 2 worlds was still constantly improving. The civilizations of the 2 universes were also becoming more and more powerful as their constructions improved. Time passed day by day. In the blink of an eye, a year had passed. During this year, the 2 of them had been constantly building these 2 worlds, trying their best to strengthen these 2 worlds and upgrade the level of these 2 worlds. Although a year had passed, these 2 worlds still belonged to the category of a minor kiliacosm. Moreover, they still hadn't reached the limit that the 2 of them could strengthen. It would take at least hundreds of millions of years to reach the limit that they could reach. However, on this day, the 2 Luo Fans coincidentally stopped at the same time. It was not because the 2 of them had a telepathic connection and felt that they should stop. Instead, the 2 of them felt at the same time that among the more than 100 worlds created by the other Luo Fan, the battle in one of the worlds had already been decided. What a pity! Luo Fan sighed. The other Luo Fan smiled and nodded without saying a word. In the world where the battle was decided, the one who won was the clone, and the one who lost was the original body that Luo Fan had brought to the other island. With a soft bang, that world was suddenly annihilated. A man whose entire body was in tatters and no longer looked like a human rushed out of that world. After he appeared, he let out a long roar toward the sky. There was an indescribable pain and inexplicable relief in his voice. The other Luo Fan waved his hand, and the cultivator's body shook. In the blink of an eye, he recovered from his original tattered appearance to his peak state. With this help, the cultivator returned to his senses. He bowed to the other Luo Fan, turned into a ray of light, and directly left the lake. Luo Fan shook his head and said to the other Luo Fan, "Even they have a winner. How about we have a winner too?" Naturally, they could not wait hundreds of millions of years until they had raised the two worlds to their limits to determine the winner, even if there was a huge difference in the flow of time in this test and the outside world, and the long years in the test were only equivalent to an extremely short time in the outside world. They could not waste time like this. Since this was the case, it was naturally fine to stop at any time to determine the winner. This time was not a special time and did not have any special meaning, but since they were interrupted, what harm was there in determining the winner? The other Luo fan only smiled and said, "That's what I was thinking." With that, he pushed the world in front of him towards Luo fan. When Luo fan saw this, he also raised his hand and pushing the world he had created towards the other party. The two worlds came into contact in an instant. In an instant, a terrifying shock wave was emitted from the point of contact, spreading out in all directions. At this moment, the two Luo fans attacked at the same time. With a sweep of their hands, they cleared away the terrifying shock waves that erupted from the contact between the two worlds, causing the two shock waves to not cause any damage to their surroundings at all. They only stirred up slight fluctuations in the lake below. At this time, the two worlds were like two water balls that were gradually fusing. There were more and more overlaps, and in a short while, the two worlds had completely become one, becoming a sphere that appeared between the two of them. This was how the two of them would determine the winner of the two worlds. Let the two worlds fuse by themselves, and wait until the end to see which world had the upper hand, and which world occupied the main body. It seems that there is not much difference between them. The other Luo fan watched the process of the two worlds fusing, and could not help but show a look of pity on his face. Of course, the time needed for the two worlds to completely fuse together would not be so short. No matter how fast it would take at least a few days for the two worlds to complete the fusion and determine the winner between the two of them. However, even if the fusion was not completed, it was not a problem for the two Luo fan to see the general trend of the fusion of the two worlds. Chapter 13-14. Between the two of them, the world formed by the two worlds was undergoing earth-shattering changes. These two worlds both had the appearance of a universe, but their essence was fundamentally different. This difference caused the two worlds to clash intensely the moment they came into contact. The laws of the two worlds were like two giant beasts, fighting and devouring each other. Both sides were constantly being devoured by each other during this process, and at the same time, they were also devouring each other. In this incomparably tragic state, the two worlds were gradually moving towards a new equilibrium, a new structure that contained the respective characteristics of both worlds. Since the two worlds were so complete, there were naturally countless living beings in each of them. The countless living beings joined the evolution of the two worlds at this time, facing each other, also carrying out an extremely tragic battle. The extremely advanced civilization of science and technology and the civilization of cultivation were like two things that could not be broken in at all, working hard to break in. Almost at every moment, an unknown number of living beings died in the process. Due to the fact that the two were evenly matched, the process of breaking in was particularly bitter. In the end, the two worlds formed a brand new stable structure, forming a brand new world. All living beings in that world, whether it was the civilization of cultivation or the civilization of science and technology, all died. The entire world that was twice as wide as before became a dead universe, and the result, obviously, as the two of them had seen before, in this universe, the world that belonged to the two sides created by Luo Fan's side was divided equally. Neither of the two worlds had the ability to suppress the other world. Between the two sides, they were completely evenly matched. Seeing this change, although the two Luo fans' faces did not show any expression of surprise, they both felt that it was a pity. Because this meant that, previously, they wanted to use peaceful means to determine the winner and the loser. But they had already failed. The two of them looked at each other. Without saying anything, the two of them stepped forward at the same time, directly entering the world that they had created together. This world. It looked like the void of the universe, the flow of time in the entire world. It was many times faster than the outside world. Although from the outside, the two worlds had just merged into one, and the living beings in the world had just been completely wiped out. But when the two of them entered this world, they discovered that the entire world was no longer deathly silent. Every corner of the world was enveloped in an invisible and indescribable vitality. This formless vitality had given birth to countless life forms on the many planets in the universe. Some of these creatures were born with the appearance of cultivators and possessed extraordinary abilities. Some, on the other hand, possessed extraordinary intelligence and instinctively began to develop a technological civilization. However, compared to the time when the two worlds were still separated, the living beings born in this world were different from each other. But it was no longer as extreme as before. Moreover, they were no longer so far apart from each other. Instead, they were born directly on the same planet. It was obvious that this was the phenomenon formed after the two worlds fused together. This meant that after the two worlds fused, they became more inclusive, more complete, more powerful, and more stable. The two Luo fans floated in the starry sky of the universe, facing each other from a distance. The regretful expression on their faces gradually disappeared. Previously, they had each opened up a world and compared the strength of this world. Their direct goal was naturally to use the power of this world to see the difference in strength between them and see if they could use a peaceful method to determine the winner and loser. But it was also to create a battlefield for the battle between the two of them. Just as mentioned before, if the shock waves from their battle weren't restricted, the entire island would be completely destroyed by the shock waves from their battle. This was obviously not in their best interest. Therefore, they obviously needed a place to provide space for the two of them to fight in order to avoid causing damage to the island. It was also because of this goal that they had chosen the idea of opening up a world to determine the victor among so many peaceful methods. With a slight thought in Luo Fan's heart, the halo behind his head trembled slightly. In an instant, everything in the entire universe directly entered his heart, allowing him to directly control everything in the universe. At this moment, he also felt an inexplicable sense sweep through the range of the universe he sensed. In an instant, Luo Fan knew that this was the means of the other Luo Fan. The other Luo Fan also used the same method to control everything in the universe. After understanding this, Luo Fan raised his eyes and looked at the other Luo Fan. At the same time, he saw that the other party was also looking at him. For a moment, the two of them smiled slightly. Before they finished smiling, the two of them raised their hands and slapped at each other at the same time. In an instant, the extremely powerful forces collided in the middle, producing a terrifying impact. In an instant, half of the universe was shattered by the shock wave produced by the collision of their palms. All the matter that made up the stars and planets directly mixed together, turning half of the universe into a strange area that seemed to be covered in a dense fog. In addition, the two Luo Fan also directly sensed that in the depths of this world, the rules and laws layer, time, space, matter, energy, and other existences were also receiving intense vibrations, as if they could completely collapse at any time and then mix with the strange fog that covered half of the universe. Such a situation was within the expectations of the two Luo Fans. At the beginning of the battle, the two of them would have made the same choice. Only with the passage of time, as the battle continued, as their inspirations continued to burst forth, and as the battle became more and more intense, the differences between them gradually revealed themselves. Only then did they gradually reveal some differences in their methods. It was just like how the two of them had opened up their own worlds. In the beginning, the worlds that they had opened up were exactly the same, but as time went on, the worlds that they had opened up gradually changed. However, as they continued to perfect that world, as they continued to change that world, the two worlds finally became two completely different universes. Because of this reason, they were now using the same method and the same power. The same attack strength. That was extremely normal. As for the two of them, obviously they had also thought of this. At the moment when their attacks annihilated each other, they did not hesitate for even a millionth of a second and directly attacked again. The types of magic powers that Luo Fan possessed were unimaginable. Moreover, he could create billions of magic powers and techniques with just a raise of his hand and a single move. At this moment, he displayed them without any scruples. That scene was truly magnificent and vast beyond everyone's imagination. The entire universe was completely enveloped in the endless magic powers at this moment. In just a few short breaths, the entire universe was shattered and reshaped thousands of times. In the process, the many living creatures that had originally been born in this universe were also completely erased and recreated tens of thousands of times. An inexplicable sense of carefreeness gradually emerged in Luo Fan's heart. This feeling of being able to unleash his abilities and methods without any worries, without worrying about whether his opponent's strength far exceeded his own, and the feeling of being able to destroy his methods and body in a way that he couldn't understand was truly an unprecedented experience for him, and it made him feel an indescribable sense of joy. At this moment, Luo Fan was extremely glad that he had come here. He was glad that he had arranged for the unification of the entire island back then, thus triggering the sage's test and creating an identical version of himself to fight with him. This was what he thought. Thinking about it, the other Luo Fan on the opposite side should also be thinking the same thing. This process continued continuously. 1 month, 2 months, 1 year, 2 years. In the first few months, the power of the two Luo Fans' magic powers was almost exactly the same. Almost every time they used their magic powers, they would annihilate each other. Every time they used their methods, they would come into contact with each other at the same time, resulting in a terrifying shock wave that swept across the universe. It would either cause terrifying damage to the universe or recover the damage caused to the universe previously. In short, the effect was extremely obvious and shocking. However, as time passed, after a few months, the difference between the two of them gradually began to show. The divine abilities that they used gradually became different, and the methods that they chose to deal with each other in the same state also gradually deviated a little. This deviation was not huge in the beginning, and both of them could predict it. When they fought, their states were not much different from the first few months. However, this difference continued to grow as time continued to pass. After a few years, the difference in their choices had already reached an extremely shocking level. It directly caused the two Luo Fans to become two completely different people. No matter what choice they made, the magic powers that they used at any particular moment were no longer similar. Because of this difference, the battle between the two of them became even more intense, and also became even more unpredictable. This kind of battle also began to look like a real battle. The suspense of the battle between the two of them also began to increase. Even if both of them had the same strength and cultivation, in a battle, it might not necessarily be a draw. Different choices made at different times, different judgments made at different times, all of these would affect the final outcome of the battle. In other words, in this kind of battle between two existences with similar cultivation, the final outcome would depend on how the other party performed. As the difference between the two of them grew larger, Luo Fan became more and more immersed in the battle. All of his wisdom was boiling. All the magic powers that he had learned and created over the years continuously emerged from the depths of his memory during this process. At the same time, countless magic powers were created at the same time. Everything in the outside world. The change of time gradually left him. In his eyes, there was only the existence of the Luo Fan that was exactly the same as him. In his heart, there were only countless mysteries of the great Tao, countless truths of heaven and earth, as well as the countless magic powers and techniques that were born from them. As this process continued, the gap between the two Luo Fans began to gradually show. That was the clone of Luo Fan. In this process, he gradually fell into a disadvantageous position. The battle gradually turned in the direction of Luo Fan's favor. The reason for this was very simple. That was the clone of Luo Fan. Although everything was exactly the same as Luo Fan, whether it was the memory or cultivation, or the power of magic powers, even the magic treasures and everything else he had were all the same. However, compared to Luo Fan, he still had some differences. The difference was that everything he had was directly created by a saint-level existence through his own means. Everything that Luo Fan had was obtained through his own efforts, bit by bit. This difference would not have any effect on anything under normal circumstances. One could not even see the difference between the two. However, when their wisdom was stimulated to the limit, and their fighting instincts were raised to the peak, this kind of difference would be extremely obvious. The reason was very simple. The directly created memories, cultivation, and strength were directly achieved, so there was no continuity with everything in the past. At the same realm, he would naturally be able to perform extremely well, but when he needed to follow these memories, these cultivation, these strength to develop again, to rise again, what he had directly achieved would become lacking in strength. To put it in a straightforward way, it was like Luo Fan's memories of the great heaven primordial world. Because Luo Fan had personally experienced the memories, these memories were incomparably fresh to him. They were connected to everything in his body. Who knew when, due to some encounter, memories that he did not have before would be stimulated, and thus provide some assistance to the magic powers and techniques he was currently creating. As for the other Luo Fan, who had directly created these memories, because he did not directly experience the great heaven primordial world, he could only use these memories. Even if the saint had completely replicated everything about Luo Fan, including the memories of his body, it was still much more difficult to stimulate the memories than it was for Luo Fan. In other words, with the same experience, perhaps Luo Fan could stimulate the same memories, but for the other Luo Fan, the stimulation was not enough. It would take a few more times for it to be stimulated. This kind of subtle difference would continue to accumulate, and in the end, the gap would become bigger and bigger, more and more terrifying. In the end, it would cause the originally balanced situation between the two of them to change, causing the two of them who were originally equal in strength and cultivation to have a bigger and bigger gap in strength. Because of this, Luo Fan was gradually suppressing the other him, causing the direction of victory to tilt more and more in his favor, from tilting in the direction of victory and defeat, until a winner was decided. 1,000 years had passed since then. After 1,000 years, the universe that the two of them had created had turned into a paste. It looked gray, and even time and space had become extremely chaotic, as if it did not exist at all. At this time, Luo Fan's entire body was already in tatters. There were scars all over his body. Looking at his appearance, it was as if he had been smashed tens of thousands of times and reformed tens of thousands of times in the blink of an eye. Each time, only a tiny trace was left. Each time, it was only a tiny trace. After accumulating for tens of thousands of times, of course, it was in its current state. Luo Fan was like this, but the other Luo Fan was in an even worse state. At this moment, as he stood there, the scars all over his body were many times more numerous than Luo Fan's. More importantly, his entire body was emitting an inexplicable death chi. It was as if he was already dead, and his entire body had turned into the tiniest particles. The reason why he was maintaining his human form was only because a powerful obsession was binding his body, and the feeling of his entire body constantly seeping out. "I won," Luo Fan said with some disappointment. Instant. Even a saint can't change this fact." The other Luo Fan sighed and said. Luo Fan could know the difference between the original body and the clone, so he could also think of this. At this time, he naturally knew the reason for his defeat. Who knows? Perhaps a saint has the ability to change it, but they just didn't use it on you. With our realm, Trying to guess a saint's divine ability is like trying to guess the feeling of a summer insect trying to guess the feeling of ice. It's really a bit ridiculous, Luo Fan said with a bitter smile. The other Luo Fan heard this, shook his head, and sighed. That's right. This is where the tragedy lies. Existences like us really have too little understanding of saints. What abilities a saint has, what they don't have, what they can do, and what they can't do, all of these can only be guessed. And after guessing, we don't even know if it's right or wrong. Even if there are 10,000 reasons to tell you that you're right, you can't be sure if these reasons are true or if the saints are purposely showing them. And existences like us, based on such information, seek to reach the realm that we can't even understand, to become existences that we can't even guess at. How tragic! Chapter 13:15. As the other Luo Fan collapsed, this universe, which had already turned into a chaotic state, also gradually collapsed and turned into nothingness. A lake gradually appeared in front of Luo Fan. Even though nearly 1,000 years had passed in that world, it was still a long time ago. However, to the outside world, only a few years had passed since the two Luo Fan entered that world to fight. This lake had not changed much compared to before. Even the ordinary wooden boat looked exactly the same as before. However, it was not as if nothing had changed. At the very least, the original 100 or so worlds had been reduced to only a few at this time. It was very obvious that most of the cultivators that had come to this island with Luo Fan had already won against their clones. As for the specific outcome, Luo Fan did not care. There had to be some victories and some defeats. As for the victors, whether it was the cultivators that came with Luo Fan or the clones on the island, they all left after the victor was decided. Not a single one of them stayed. At the instant that Luo Fan came out, another world shattered and a figure appeared before Luo Fan. This figure was covered in wounds, and his mental state was extremely fatigued. With one look, Luo Fan knew that he was the cultivator who had come to the duplicate island with him. In other words, he was the original cultivator. After the cultivator came out, his eyes were slightly dazed. After a long while, only then did he regain his senses. In the worlds created by the other Luo Fan, the flow of time was also different from the outside world. A year in the outside world was equivalent to many years in that world. They had entered that world a few years ago, and it was obvious that the years they had experienced were counted in thousands of years. After thousands of years of war, he couldn't help but feel a little lost after returning to a state of peace. However, he was a powerful cultivator after all. Even though he was only a minor accomplishment quasi-sage, he was still a powerful cultivator. Although he was only a minor accomplishment quasi-sage, his Tao heart was already extremely tough. Very soon, the cultivator came back to his senses and bowed to Luo Fan. He said, "Thank you, Senior, for giving me this opportunity. I hope that you will be successful in the future. It must be because of this opportunity. You fought for it yourself. Make good use of it," Luo Fan said calmly. The cultivator bowed once more. After bowing to Luo Fan, he turned around and turned into a long rainbow. He left the place and disappeared in front of Luo Fan. Luo Fan only said that he would give them a chance, but he didn't say that he would take them back to that island. At this time, since they had obtained this opportunity and fought with their replicas, it was naturally impossible for them to stay by Luo Fan's side and wait for him to take them back. Even if some cultivators had different thoughts and wanted to stay, it was impossible for them to be thick-skinned enough to stay in such an empty scene. Luo Fan didn't care about his departure. His expression didn't change, and he just waited quietly. The remaining few worlds before him were all under his control at this moment. With just a thought, he had gained complete control of these worlds and knew everything that had happened in these worlds over a period of time. This wasn't hard to understand. These worlds were originally created by the other Luo Fan. When the other Luo Fan created these worlds, His mentality, memories, thoughts, abilities, and power were exactly the same as Luo Fan's. Since that was the case, after the other Luo Fan died, Luo Fan would naturally be able to take over these worlds with just a thought. It was as if he had created these worlds. With a thought, after seeing all the remaining worlds clearly, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh. Among these worlds, among the cultivators that Luo Fan had brought, only 2 of them could defeat their clones. The remaining few were just struggling at death's door. Not long after, they would be killed by the clones' attack. Their souls would scatter, and even all traces of their existence would be erased. Sensing this, Luo Fan just shook his head and turned to leave. Although those cultivators came to this island with him, it didn't mean that Luo Fan had to be responsible for their lives. The battle between them and their clones was the result of their own choice. Since it was their own choice, they naturally had to bear the result of the battle, enjoy victory, and feel defeat with a single step. He traversed an unknown number of trillions of kilometers in an instant. From the lake at the center of the island, he instantly returned to the lake at the center of the main island. He also appeared on the wooden boat. Compared to before the battle with the clone, Luo Fan's strength had increased by quite a bit. Moreover, the power of his spells had become much more exquisite due to the burst of inspiration and intelligence. His methods of using laws were also much more exquisite than before. Because of this change, he was able to easily cross the 2 huge islands and the unimaginably vast ocean between the 2 islands. Although he only directly crossed it, the moment he passed through the duplicate island, he discovered that the duplicate island was undergoing a terrifying integration process. All the power on the entire island was gradually gathering, ready to head to the main island at any time. Different from the duplicate island, the original island was peaceful and tranquil. Compared to before, there was no difference at all. It was as if they were still in the demon world, and not participating in the trial set up by the saint. They were not at risk of being attacked by another island that was exactly the same as this one at any time. At a glance, Luo Fan knew that the Ling Kingdom's emperor had long placed his hopes on his method. He was ready to surrender to another island at any time. However, these things did not matter at all to the current Luo Fan. Naturally, the Ling Kingdom's emperor and other cultivators would deal with them. When Luo Fan returned to the wooden boat, he began to close his eyes again and carefully comprehend the colorless and transparent halo behind his head, savoring the mystery of the primitive world in the halo. Compared to before the battle with the clone, Luo Fan had more inspiration at this moment, and his wisdom seemed to be more profound. Many problems that would have taken him a long time to deduce and solve were now clear at a glance. There were countless mysteries that he could not understand at all. At this moment, traces of clues began to appear. Through his understanding of the primitive world, Luo Fan had a deeper understanding of the uniqueness of the demon world. In a trance, he suddenly understood how the 54 differences between the great Tao of the demon world and the great Tao of the primitive world came about. There were billions of differences between the great Tao of the demon world and the great Tao of the primitive world. But between these differences, in summary, there were 54 origins. This was what Luo Fan had spent endless energy to deduce. It might also contain how the 54 sages of the Devil Realm became sages. It also contained the mystery of why this primitive world was called an opportunity to become a saint by the Buddhist Supreme. However, before this, Luo Fan's eyes seemed to be covered by a layer of fog. No matter how hard he tried to think and search, he could not find the root of it, nor could he know what was going on. But now, that incomprehensible thing suddenly appeared in front of Luo Fan, as if it was common sense that had long been lying there. The 54 different origins between the great Tao of the demon world and the great Tao of the primitive world were clearly the result of the 54 saints completely connecting their own great Tao with the great Tao of the demon world. It was precisely because they had connected their own great ways with the great ways of the Devil Realm that there were 54 kinds of changes in the Devil Realm. As a result, the great ways of the entire devil realm were gradually changed, causing so many subtle changes in the great ways of the devil realm. Even Luo Fan boldly speculated that perhaps it was because the saints connected their own great Tao with the great Tao of the demon world that they became saints. That was what allowed them to possess such an incredible divine ability and obtain such a supreme trait of being eternally indestructible and indestructible. This seemed to be somewhat contradictory to the Tao Master Realm cultivators being able to manifest all their cultivation achievements, leaving the great Tao of the natural world and overriding the great Tao. But in fact, this couldn't be simpler. Cultivation was a continuous process of reincarnation. For any cultivator, after reaching the pinnacle of each realm, they would break through and step into the beginning of another realm. Then, the beginning would continue to rise until they reached another pinnacle, waiting to step into the beginning of the next realm. According to this cultivation principle, when a cultivator was in the Tao Master Realm, he would pursue his own great Tao to transcend the great Tao of the natural world, and finally connect his own great Tao with the great Tao of the natural world. However, these were only two levels in the process of cultivation, and there was no contradiction. Of course, this did not mean that directly putting one's own great Tao into the great Tao of the natural world was equivalent to becoming a saint. According to Luo Fan's current understanding, when the saints connected their own great Tao with the great Tao of the demon world, it was as if the great Tao of the demon world had grown limbs. Although it was rooted in the great Tao of the natural world, it was not the same as the great Tao of the natural world, and had relative independence. However, directly putting the condensed great Tao into the great Tao of the natural world was equivalent to giving up one's own cultivation achievements, and letting the great Tao of the natural world assimilate the condensed great Tao. There was only one inevitable consequence of doing so, and that was that the person would become the puppet of the great Tao, lose all self, and become the incarnation of the great Tao at the level of living beings. So it's like this. No wonder the saints of the demon world can't be compared to the 7 great saints of the Earth universe. Luo Fan thought about this and suddenly sighed in his heart. Turning one's own great Tao into the limbs of the great Tao of the natural world, and connecting with it, could retain all the power of the great Tao of the natural world at will, and also have the consequences of having extreme independence. But at the same time, it also made the saints inseparable from the world. It formed a close relationship where one would suffer, and the other would prosper. Could this still be considered as a saint? The saints were supposed to be eternal and indestructible. They were great existences that would not be destroyed even if the world was destroyed, and they would not be destroyed if the world was damaged. Now that they were in this world, they could obtain almost omnipotent and omniscient. They had the terrifying ability to know everything. As long as the world was not destroyed, they would exist forever, and would not be harmed by any force. But once the world was destroyed, they would die along with the world. They would not even have the ability to move to another perfect world to survive. Such existences, how could they still be called a real saint? The pseudo-saint realm, the pseudo-saint realm. Perhaps these saints are the real pseudo-saints. Luo Fan sighed, and instantly lost any interest in using the opportunity left by the Buddha to become a saint. Not to mention that he knew that after more than 3 billion years, the entire Earth universe would collapse and shatter into endless fragments due to the arrival of the Great Tribulation of heaven and earth. It might even affect those saints, and cause the death of countless saints. Even if he did not know this, with his ambition, he would not be willing to be shackled in the demon realm, and be a so-called saint who could not even leave the demon realm at will. In fact, after he guessed how the demon realm saint became a saint, he already had a general idea of how to use the primitive world to become a demon realm saint. The nature of the primitive world was still unknown to Luo Fan, but its appearance was actually like the newly born demon realm. Even its grand Tao was the same as the demon realm that had just been born. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan, who had obtained absolute authority in the primitive world, could naturally experiment and find a way to place his condensed Great Tao on the Great Tao of the primitive world, which was the Great Tao of the demon realm. In the end, when he could finally do this perfectly, he would naturally be able to directly place his condensed Great Tao on the real Great Tao of the demon realm, and thus give himself a chance to become a demon realm saint. Of course, this was only a rough guess. Even if he wanted to become a demon realm saint with the help of the primitive world, there would definitely be many difficulties. Even if Luo Fan could think of the opinions of the other 54 sages, such as the changes between the Great Tao of the demon realm and the primitive world because of the existence of the 54 sages, the method to find might be quite troublesome, and might require endless complicated means. Even if he succeeded in the end, he might need many means to maintain it, and so on. It might be complicated beyond his imagination. Sighing in his heart, Luo Fan had already decided that he could no longer hang the halo behind his head carelessly. To him, the primitive world was only an existence that helped him cultivate. Using the primitive world to become a demon realm saint was not too tempting to him. However, it was different for other cultivators. If there were cultivators who knew this method and were interested in it, the result could be imagined when they saw the halo. It would definitely be an extremely tragic battle of life and death. Luo Fan was not willing to fight to the death for the sake of this halo. Thinking of this, Luo Fan had a thought. Countless changes appeared in this world, and these endless changes eventually pointed to the void a few feet in front of Luo Fan. Among these changes, a half-step pseudo-sage treasure appeared in front of him. It was he who directly activated the second level of the law of causality and created another half-step pseudo-sage treasure. This half-step pseudo-holy treasure was completely different from the half-step pseudo-holy treasure that he had created before. It was in the shape of a copper mirror. This bronze mirror was only the size of a human head. There were no decorations on it, and both sides were extremely flat. It looked very simple. After this half-step pseudo-sage treasure was formed, Luo Fan thought of something, and the colorless and transparent halo behind his head suddenly shrank and directly crashed into the surface of the bronze mirror. As the halo crashed into it, the bronze mirror suddenly shook violently. Boundless light and shadows appeared on the surface of the mirror in an instant, producing billions of strange colors, illuminating the surface of the mirror as if it was a space-time passageway. As the mirror's surface changed, the mirror's aura also started to rise drastically. The aura of the half-step pseudo-sage treasure began to be replaced by the aura of a true pseudo-sage treasure. Obviously, the integration of the halo had allowed a half-step pseudo-sage treasure that had just been born to break through its limit and become a level 1 pseudo-sage treasure. As the aura of the level 1 pseudo-sage treasure stabilized on the treasure, the light and shadows on the surface of the mirror also stabilized. It transformed into a vast world, a primitive world filled with the civilization of the Buddhist Tao. It was filled with vitality and the mysteries of the Buddhist Tao. After such a change, this mirror was more like a Buddhist country established by a Buddha than a treasure. After doing all this, Luo Fan was finally relieved. Chapter 13-16. In the demon realm, after the island where the Ling kingdom was located disappeared, the island once again appeared in the boundless sea. However, compared to a moment ago, the entire island had undergone an earth-shattering change. The entire island was filled with traces of battle. Even the living beings on the island had lost a significant amount of their lives. This number of living beings, when added up, was a population that could be calculated in the trillions. The originally unified Ling kingdom had been completely broken up in the process, turning into countless small forces. It was almost a repeat of the situation when the entire island was divided into tens of thousands of countries. At this moment, on the lake at the center of the island, Luo Fan was the same as before. He was also sitting on the wooden boat with his eyes closed, comprehending the bronze mirror that had appeared in his hand. For the demon realm, only a moment had passed. However, in reality, tens of thousands of years had already passed since the sage's test on this island. That's right, tens of thousands of years had passed. Back then, according to Luo Fan's calculations, as long as the main island took the initiative to admit defeat the moment the two island armies came into contact, the battle and the test would end. However, it was a pity that the reality was not as he had imagined. In other words, it was the same as what he had expected at the beginning, but the subsequent development was beyond Luo Fan's expectations. 10 years after entering the trial space, the clone island had gathered billions of troops and finally attacked the main island. As for the Ling Kingdom's emperor, just like the solution that Luo Fan had given back then, he directly went forward and handed over the surrender form outside the island, indicating that he had admitted defeat and that victory belonged to the clone. At that time, the clone was extremely surprised. After discussing for a few months, they finally decided to accept the surrender form. They put away the surrender form, as well as the imperial seal of the Ling Kingdom's emperor and many other items that represented sovereignty. Then, they naturally retreated. They returned to their homeland, which was the Clone Island. Originally, in Luo Fan's expectation, this test should be like this. Soon, they would be able to leave the trial space. However, after a full 10 years, the Ling Nation Emperor realized that he was still in the trial space. Moreover, this island should have been able to produce its own resources and population, but now it couldn't. The entire island seemed to have been fixed at a certain time. For a full 10 years, who knew how many trillions of newborns should have appeared, but not a single one appeared. Moreover, they had not left the trial space at all. They were still in the trial space, facing the island that was far away from them. This made them realize that this method could not avoid war at all. There was no way to pass the trial. After knowing this, the living beings on both the original island and the clone island began to lose their composure. Under such circumstances, the Ling Nation's emperor no longer had the intention to consult Luo Fan. Instead, he took the initiative to launch a battle against the clone island. He took the initiative to gather an army, cross the distant sea, and attack the clone island. At that time, the island of the clone was already prepared. The moment the two sides came into contact, the battle became extremely tragic. No one could easily suppress the other. Because both sides were prepared, and sometimes it was the clone island's home ground, the result was obvious. That attack did not end the battle. After a few years, the power of the original island was scattered, and the remaining remnants were directly beaten back, returning to their original island. Such a tragic failure naturally made the Ling Nation Emperor furious. However, in contrast to this failure, after the outbreak of the war, the time on the two islands that seemed to have stopped seemed to flow again. The resources that had stopped producing began to produce themselves again. The newborns that should not have been born also began to be born. Everything returned to normal. This situation made the Ling Nation Emperor angry, but he also knew that he was walking on the right path. Under such circumstances, he naturally would not reject this kind of war. For a long time to come, the two islands were like this. You attacked once, then it was scattered. I attacked again, then it was scattered again. Just like that, the cycle repeated itself. It was repeated over and over again. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. In the end, even the Ling Nation Emperor changed dozens of times, and the entire country was reformed dozens of times. The result of the war between the two islands was finally revealed. The result was obvious. Naturally, the original island, which many cultivators did not attack, had failed. The result of this failure was this: the entire island split again. After tens of thousands of years of evolution, the number of living beings on the island did not increase, but decreased, becoming what it was today. Of course, in contrast to the huge damage that the original island suffered, the clone island also suffered quite a lot. In the end, although it performed better than the original island, it was still in the process of splitting. However, this was obviously meaningless to the clone island. Everything on the clone island, including the island itself, appeared to be a trial for the original island. The goal of their existence was to determine the outcome of the battle with the original island. Since the victor had already been decided, the destruction of the clone island wouldn't affect them at all. In any case, regardless of whether they were still alive at the end of the trial, when the trial was over, they would be completely erased. They would completely disappear from the world, as if they had never existed. Currently, everything on this island was so unfamiliar to Luo Fan. Whether it was the Ling nation's emperor or the other cultivators he had met before, everything had become something he was no longer familiar with. Even the heavenly gods, divine gods, and the others had changed considerably compared to before the trial, and had also become unfamiliar to him. After all, it was the trial of the saints, and it was both tragic and unparalleled. Compared to the cultivators who had deliberately avoided the trial and stayed out of it, in a war that involved trillions of soldiers, the saints were simply too weak. He also seemed so small. It was impossible for him to completely maintain his sense of self. Only Luo Fan, who was considered the absolute peak existence on this island, could remain eternally unmoved, unaffected by all external forces, and maintain his original beliefs. It's time to go to the 4 continents. Sensing that the island had returned to the Devil Realm, Luo Fan put the bronze mirror into his universe within sleeve. He slowly stood up. That was what he thought. At this moment there was nothing special about his body at all. He looked like an ordinary living being. At this moment, the rune structure that had always existed on his body, the rune structure that isolated him from the inside and outside of his body, preventing others from discovering his flawless and unhindered nature, had also completely disappeared. The disappearance of the rune structure was not only because it was connected to the Ling Kingdom, but also because the transition of the Ling Kingdom was closely related to the degree of restraint on the people. Now that the Ling Kingdom had perished, the rune structure would naturally disappear. More importantly, the current Luo Fan no longer needed to rely on the rune structure to completely conceal himself. With just a thought, he could naturally make it so that no one could see him and give birth to the rank 3 pseudo-holy mark in the depths of his soul. During the tens of thousands of years of the trial, the war between the 2 islands was in full swing, but Luo Fan did not care about it at all. During these years, he had been constantly comprehending the primeval world that had been integrated into the first-level pseudo-sage treasure. Although he did not intend to use this primeval world to become a saint of the Devil Realm, that did not mean that he was dismissive of this primeval world. On the contrary, it was precisely because he had no interest in using this primeval world to become a saint of the Devil Realm that he paid more attention to this primeval world and devoted more attention to it. That was because without the temptation of becoming a saint, he noticed the abnormality of this primeval world, and vaguely had some guesses about the nature of this primeval world. In the beginning, this primeval world was exactly the same as when the Devil Realm had just been established, and it was not just the same on the surface. Inside, be it the nomological layer, time, space, matter, energy, or the great Tao that was integrated with the nomological layer, they were all the same. At first glance, such a situation did not seem like much. However, if one thought about it carefully, they would find it terrifying. One had to know that the Devil Realm was a world that could be compared to the Earth universe, and it might even be a world that was jointly established by the 7 sages of the Earth universe. Such a world was already close to a perfect world, and to a certain extent, it could even be regarded as a truly perfect world. How could such a world appear so easily? Moreover, how could it appear in the hands of the Buddhist venerable? Therefore, he could predict that although this world looked the same as when the Devil Realm had just been established, it was definitely not a world of that level. Therefore, he could predict that although this world looked the same as when the Devil Realm had just been established, it was extremely likely that it wasn't even a world. With such an understanding, how could Luo Fan not be curious about this primeval world? How could he let it go? Over the past tens of thousands of years, Luo Fan had comprehended this primordial world. Although he still hadn't found the essence of this world, he had vaguely grasped some tiny traces. He had more understanding of the usage of the various mysteries and the various methods of using power. Once this understanding was revealed, he would be able to guard himself without the rune structure at this moment. Because of this, no one would be able to obtain the grade 3 pseudo-saint mark that was naturally bestowed upon him due to his flawless state. Of course, this was the most direct manifestation. Many other divine abilities, and even the use of the law of cause and effect, had more or less improved. However, there were many other improvements. With a slight sigh, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure instantly disappeared from the central lake, which was the half-step pseudo-saint treasure that he had created in the beginning, and headed toward the 4 vast continents in the center. It had been a long time since he had entered the Devil Realm, even if he counted the time that had passed in the Devil Realm itself. However, he was still living and cultivating on a small island at the edge of the Devil Realm. He had always been far away from the center of the Devil Realm. No matter how he looked at it, it didn't make sense. 54 sages fighting, I wonder what it will be like. On the way to the central island, Luo Fan suddenly had some inexplicable expectations in his heart. Given the power of Luo Fan's divine ability, if he had no scruples, it wouldn't take much time to reach the central island. It would only take him a few days at most. However, it was obvious. Although Luo Fan was already a rank 3 pseudo-saint, he could already be regarded as an invincible powerhouse on the island he had first entered. However, in the entire demon realm, it was still not enough. If he wanted to be truly fearless, he would have to be extremely powerful. He was still far from being able to do so. The demon world was too vast, and there were too many experts in it. During the journey, Luo Fan had an unprecedented feeling that the island he had stayed on for a long time was at the edge of the wilderness of the Devil Realm. This was because the more he moved forward, the more he found that there were many powerful auras blocking his way. Among these auras, the weakest ones might only be at the quasi-sage level, but the stronger ones were at the level 7 or level 8 pseudo-saint. Along the way, Luo Fan even felt the faint aura of a level 9 pseudo-sage cultivator. These auras weren't actually targeting Luo Fan, but they didn't have any hostility towards Luo Fan. However, they occupied a large area. Some of them were on an island, some were on a sea, and some even opened up a vast void in the void. The existence of so many auras made it impossible for Luo Fan to unleash his speed to the fullest. The reason for that was because if he did that, it would be a provocation to them, a disrespect to them. If Luo Fan didn't want to complicate things, he would have to slow down and show them some respect. However, although Luo Fan had no choice but to slow down because of these auras, he didn't feel too upset. Instead, he was enjoying it. He would pass through most of the territories with powerful auras, but he would stop for a while when there were some auras that he was interested in. He would stay for a few days or a few months to observe the various landscapes and customs in the territory with the auras. If he encountered the owner of a friendly aura, he would even visit them as a guest for a period of time and interact with them. Although this experience didn't benefit Luo Fan much, and he didn't comprehend any incredible mysteries or improve his cultivation, it broadened his horizons and allowed him to have a deeper understanding of the demon realm. He also gained some understanding of the rules of the entire demon realm. Luo Fan already knew some of these rules from Xianwen, the sect master of the Azure Temple. However, Xianwen was only a pseudo-saint back then. Although he wasn't at the bottom of the demon realm, his level wasn't high either, and his knowledge was limited. How could he compare to the pseudo-saint existences that Luo Fan visited? On this day, Luo Fan arrived at an empty sea. His heart suddenly skipped a beat as he sensed an inexplicable familiar aura. It's actually here. He smiled faintly. At this moment, the aura that he sensed suddenly skyrocketed by dozens of times. The aura, which was originally faintly diffusing and faintly indicating the scope of its influence, suddenly condensed into a substance. It directly condensed into a substance in the area of thousands of miles around Luo Fan's body, forming a strange world. A world whose color and shape couldn't be described with words. Luo Fan was extremely familiar with this world. It was the strange world that he had entered when he participated in the Buddhist Supreme's test. Looks like I'm in luck today. You actually appeared in front of me at this time. A voice filled with endless anger rang in Luo Fan's ears. Luo Fan's memory was amazing. He knew who the voice belonged to as soon as he heard it. Coupled with the world that was formed by the aura in front of him, how could he not know who it was? That was obviously the pseudo-saint level 6 that he had encountered when he participated in the Buddhist Supreme's test and had several conflicts with. So it's you, fellow Taoist. What a coincidence. In the past, Luo Fan might have paid some attention to such an existence. However, not only had he become a pseudo-saint level 3 now, but he had also comprehended the second level of the law of karma. His strength was much stronger than before, so why would he still care about this person? What a coincidence. A figure gradually condensed in front of Luo Fan. It was indeed the pseudo-saint level 6. However, compared to before, his expression was unsightly at this moment. He seemed extremely gloomy and cold, and there was even an indescribable ferocity faintly mixed within. He seemed as if he wished for nothing more than to immediately pounce on Luo Fan and tear him to shreds and swallow him. Chapter 13:17. The level 6 pseudo-sage sneered and said, "I hope you can maintain this good attitude later." As he spoke, he raised his hand and grabbed at Li Hao. With this grab, it was as if the entire universe had been sucked into his hand. In a trance, Luo Fan seemed to have been pulled into an incomparably strange space-time. There was even a vague state of chaos that was about to assimilate everything and destroy everything. Compared to what he had encountered in the Buddhist Supreme's test, this level 6 pseudo-sage was more than 10,000 times stronger. As soon as he attacked, it was a terrifying technique that could destroy heaven and earth and restore the universe to silence. Facing such a technique, Luo Fan's expression did not change, but there was a flash of realization in his eyes. This was the true strength of a level 6 pseudo-sage. In the Buddhist Supreme's test, most of his strength was restricted, and he could only use less than a 10,000th of his strength. However, although Luo Fan was a little wary of such a level 6 pseudo-sage, he was not afraid of him. Even if it was a little troublesome to deal with him, it was not impossible. With a thought, his figure flashed, and a terrifying wave was emitted from his body, rushing out. In an instant, the feeling that he was about to fall into an extremely strange spacetime caused by the level 6 pseudo-sage's grab, and the feeling of chaos that was about to descend and destroy everything was completely broken. At this moment, the grab of the level 6 pseudo-sage had become so normal. At most, it was just a little stronger, and the surrounding spacetime was shattered. It formed some spacetime fog around the grab. However, such a grab was nothing to Luo Fan. He smiled slightly, raised his hand, and pointed at the level 6 pseudo-sage's finger. In an instant, a powerful force was born out of thin air, and it collided with the level 6 pseudo-sage's hand. The nature of the wave was different from the one emitted by Luo Fan's body, but it was equally terrifying. It swept out in all directions, directly stirring the surrounding time and space into pieces. It took a while for it to recover. However, that was all there was to it. With this move, neither Luo Fan nor the level 6 pseudo-sacred sage were injured. Obviously, Luo Fan pointed. However, he did not gain the upper hand. Seeing this, the level 6 pseudo-sage began to panic. His expression changed drastically. If Luo Fan was a 6th grade pseudo-martial sage, he would naturally be able to accept such an outcome. He wasn't so arrogant as to think that he could kill someone who was at the same level as him. However, the person before him was only a level 3 pseudo-saint. Normally speaking, he could crush countless of such existences with a single finger. But now, he had actually let it go. The attack that he had sent out in anger was actually so easily dealt with by the other party. How could he not be shocked? "What treasure did you use?" he asked instinctively. However, after he asked this question, he knew that he had asked a silly question. No matter what the reason was, he wanted to destroy the other party's soul, so why would the other party tell him his secret? After understanding this, he didn't wait for Luo Fan's answer. With a thought, a tortoise shell appeared above his head and floated 3 feet above his head. An inexplicable light was emitted from the tortoise shell, causing the spacetime within a radius of 100 million miles to change completely. A vast and boundless world replaced the original sea area. So it's a tortoise shell. It seems that there's a reason why he obtained a tortoise shell as the proof of the test. Luo Fan was slightly shocked when he saw this. There was no doubt that this tortoise shell was a 6th grade pseudo-sacred treasure. Although the aura exuded from it was extremely obscure, its essence was so high and strong that one could tell with a slight sense. No matter what treasure you have, you must die today, the level 6 pseudo-sacred sage said angrily. As he spoke, the tortoise shell above his head suddenly shook, and a ray of light rushed out from it, transcending spacetime. It seemed to have arrived above Luo Fan's head the moment it was born, and it shrouded Luo Fan fiercely. In this light, Luo Fan felt an incomparably pure destruction. It was as if this light was the essence of pure destruction abstracted from it. Anything without substance, even if it was a world, even if it was spacetime, even if it was a nomological law, would be completely destroyed by this light. In the face of such a terrifying light, Luo Fan naturally couldn't just stand there and wait for the light to come up. With a thought, a world instantly enveloped the light. Then, as the world trembled slightly, the light was transferred directly into the state of chaos, directly triggering a tremor in the state of chaos. This tremor caused the entire demon realm, the entire Earth, the universe, and even the billions of worlds in between to experience an unknown number of trillions of changes at the same time. In the end, it condensed in one place, forming a kind of obliterating power that suddenly condensed toward Luo Fan and the level 6 pseudo-sage. This obliterating power targeted the memory, and all the consequences caused by the light. This included the world that was born because of the light, the time and space that were destroyed because of the light, and the nomological laws that were shattered because of the light. All of these were related to the light. Luo Fan had already expected this. With a move of his heart, he directly displayed the second level of the law of causality. In an instant, countless trillions of subtle changes appeared in the demon domain. Finally, they gathered together and resisted the impact of the obliterating power on his memory, preserving his memory of the light. Luo Fan could predict this and had long prepared to resist, but the level 6 pseudo-sacred sage couldn't do this. At this moment, he had no time to react at all, and was already swept by the light. Although he used a method to resist in an instant, in the end, he only managed to preserve a little bit of his memory. His eyes suddenly became a little blank, and he couldn't remember what had just happened. Seeing such a good opportunity in front of him, how could Luo Fan let it go? He took a step forward. He had already arrived in front of the level 6 pseudo-sage, and with a slap, he sent the level 6 pseudo-sage directly through the layers of spacetime barriers and all kinds of strange barriers, sending the level 6 pseudo-sage into the chaotic state. Although the level 6 pseudo-sacred sage was a little blank, he hadn't completely turned into a block of wood after all. At first, he was a little unable to react, and was sent to the barrier outside the gap between the state of chaos and the world by Luo Fan. However, just as he was about to crash into the barrier, the moment he broke through the barriers and entered the state of chaos, he finally reacted. He roared in shock and anger, and the turtle shell on his head shook slightly. It produced a powerful and unparalleled suppression force. In an instant, his body was suppressed in front of the barrier. Finally, at the last moment, he avoided the fate of being thrown into the state of chaos. At this moment, he broke out in a cold sweat. He secretly cursed the person in front of him for being extremely sinister. What kind of existence was the state of chaos? It was a place where only the supreme sages could come and go freely. Even though he had already set foot on the 6th step below the sages and had become a level 6 pseudo-sacred sage, he was still extremely fragile in front of this state of chaos. Once he was thrown into it, he wouldn't even have the slightest ability to resist. All traces of him in all spacetime would be instantly erased by the state of chaos, so that there would be no trace of his existence in the countless worlds and the memories of countless living beings. As he broke out in a cold sweat, he became even more furious and cursed. "How dare you trick me, die!" Just as he was cursing, the turtle shell on his head suddenly emitted a dazzling light and pounced towards Luo Fan. On the surface, it looked somewhat similar to the light from before, but in essence it was completely different. The light from before was the abstract essence of destruction, but the light now seemed to be an abstraction of the essence. In other words, the light from before was the purest kind of destruction, the kind of destruction that would completely destroy anything in front of it. But now, this light was a pure grab that could grab everything and send everything to wherever it wanted. All space, even if it was a world, even if it was a formless and intangible abstract existence, would be treated equally in front of this abstract grab. There was no difference at all. Luo Fan was feeling a little sorry for the level 6 pseudo-sacred sage for being able to react so quickly. Suddenly, he noticed that the level 6 pseudo-sacred sage was emitting such a light. He was shocked. "He's trying to imitate me and send me into the state of chaos. It's not that easy." With a thought, another world instantly enveloped the light that was trying to capture the essence. The essence of the light itself had astonishing grasping abilities. Even the world was within its grasp. The moment the world enveloped the light, it felt a completely different obstruction compared to when it had enveloped the previous light. It was as if a strange power was fighting with it for control of the world. However, the essence of grabbing was only grabbing after all. It was just like how a person could grab an item, but if there was another person fighting with him for it, then the speed at which he wanted to grab that item would definitely be many times slower than before. It was even extremely likely that he wouldn't be able to grab it in the end. This was the current situation. Although the light that had been abstracted from the essence itself possessed astonishing and terrifying might, it would take some time to truly grasp this world. For Luo Fan, this period of time was enough for him to send this world into the state of chaos. It just so happened that this was the barrier before entering the state of chaos. Of course, it was the barrier between heaven and earth, not the final barrier between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. After all, that gap did not exist for a level 6 pseudo-sacred sage. This saved Luo Fan a lot of effort, and he easily sent that world into the state of chaos. That world was just a minor chiliocosm that Luo Fan had casually created. It could even be considered as a minor chiliocosm. One could imagine how fragile it was. The result of such a world being sent into the state of chaos was very obvious. Almost at the same time it was sent into the state of chaos, the world was directly annihilated. Although the annihilation of the world could not destroy the essence of the light that grabbed essence, it directly exposed that light to the state of chaos. In an instant, the light was completely destroyed by the state of chaos. At the same time, a strong and strange wave broke out from it, immersing into heaven and earth, causing the earth, the universe, the demon realm, and countless worlds in between to erupt with countless subtle changes at the same time. In the end, it produced a kind of obliterating power that concentrated on Luo Fan and the level 6 pseudo-sacred sage. This time, the level 6 pseudo-sacred sage was prepared. In an instant, he used an extremely special method. As the power in his body vibrated, an unparalleled impact kept surging in his body. It kept fluctuating. Unexpectedly, that memory-obliterating power was completely blocked, and his memory of the golden light was preserved. However, at this moment, he suddenly realized. A big hand slapped toward him. This huge hand contained boundless and terrifying power. In an instant, it even made him feel that a vast kiliacosm would be completely destroyed by this hand. This power directly slapped his body, causing his whole body to tremble violently. In an instant, half of his body completely exploded. It turned into countless tiny particles. However, this was still secondary. Even if half of his body exploded to such an extent, for him, he could recover with just a thought. What made him even more panicked was that during the process of using the tortoiseshell to grab the light, the tortoiseshell's suppressive power suddenly weakened a lot. Under this power, it could no longer hold his body in place, causing his body to crash uncontrollably toward the barrier of chaos behind him. From the looks of it, he was about to break through the barrier in an instant and be directly sent into the state of chaos. How could he not panic when he felt this? One had to know that this was the state of chaos. Although he rarely sensed the primal chaos state when he was cultivating, he had still sensed it before. He was well aware of the terrifying might of the primal chaos state. If he was sent into the primal chaos state, the time he could endure it would definitely not be longer than the time he was sent into the primal chaos state. Seeing that he was about to be sent into it uncontrollably, how could he not panic? Freeze, freeze for me! He roared rapidly. At this moment, the tortoiseshell above his head emitted an abstract light that represented the suppressive essence and enveloped his body, fixing his body firmly in the void. Unfortunately, this light still needed time to erupt. It also needed some time to grow from nothing to a strength that was strong enough to fix him in place. During this period of time, it was already enough for that terrifying power to push him into the state of chaos. Save me! The sage level 6th level pseudo-sage suddenly shouted hysterically. Although this voice was only 2 words, it seemed to not need time to pass. In an instant, it spread far and wide, allowing Luo Fan to hear the content of the words clearly. At this moment, a leisurely sigh suddenly entered Luo Fan's ears. Then, the barrier leading to the state of chaos suddenly flashed with golden light. It was as if the originally fragile piece of paper had suddenly turned into a wall made of steel. It became extremely strong and exuded an eternal charm. At this moment, the body of the sage level 6th level pseudo-sage directly collided with the barrier. Following that, his entire body exploded, as if he had been completely annihilated. However, he was unable to withstand the terrifying force of the collision. However, at the last moment, the sage level 6th level pseudo-sage showed a relieved smile on his face. Then, after he exploded, the tortoiseshell rotated slightly and covered him, collecting the many tiny particles scattered by the explosion into the tortoiseshell. Then, the tortoiseshell trembled slightly and disappeared in front of the barrier leading to the state of chaos. When it reappeared, it was already in the sea region where Luo Fan encountered the sage level 6th level pseudo-sage. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat and he sighed. He knew that he could not deal with the sage level 6th level pseudo-sage in the end. He took a step forward, passed through the layers of obstacles, and arrived in the same sea region. At this moment, there was already an additional middle-aged man with a benevolent expression. This person was also a sage level 6th level pseudo-sage. However, compared to the previous sage level 6th level pseudo-sage, he had a trace of a strange charm, as if he had inexplicably transcended. At this moment, the tortoiseshell that escaped from the barrier shook slightly and collapsed. Countless tiny particles poured out of the tortoiseshell and continued to pile up in the void. After a while, the particles piled up and formed the appearance of a man. It was the Sage Level 6th Level Pseudosage. The Sage Level 6th Level Pseudosage bowed to the benevolent middle-aged man and said, "Thank you, Taoist Beisher, for saving my life." Judging from his words, the Sage Level 6th Level Pseudosage from before was this Sage Level 6th Level Pseudosage called Beisher. The middle-aged man smiled and said, "Taoist Black Turtle, there's no need to be so polite. We've been friends for hundreds of millions of years. How can I watch you die without saving you?" Hearing this, Luo Fan finally knew that the Sage Level 6th Level Pseudosage, who had fought against him so many times, was actually called Black Turtle. "So your name is Black Turtle. We've met so many times, but I only know your name today. It's really rude of me," Luo Fan said with a smile. Looking at him, it was as if the battle between him and the Black Turtle that had almost killed each other previously didn't happen at all. Such a strange behavior made the Sage Level 6th Level Pseudosage called Black Turtle fall into a trance. He felt that the situation in front of him was very strange.